The endocrine system is one of the body's most crucial regulators, operating through a network of glands that secrete hormones into the bloodstream. These hormones act as chemical messengers, traveling to target organs and tissues to maintain balance and ensure the body operates efficiently. For example, the pancreas releases insulin, which is essential for regulating blood sugar levels. Without enough insulin, conditions like diabetes can arise, highlighting the endocrine system's vital role in maintaining health. Similarly, the thyroid gland produces thyroxine, a hormone that governs your metabolism. An underactive thyroid can slow down bodily functions, while an overactive thyroid can accelerate them. This system is also responsible for managing growth and development. The pituitary gland, often referred to as the master gland, releases growth hormones that affect height and muscle development. Beyond physical growth, the endocrine system influences reproduction. For instance, the gonads produce hormones like estrogen and testosterone, which play a pivotal role in sexual development and reproductive functions. Stress management is another significant function. When faced with a threat, the adrenal glands release adrenaline and cortisol, which prepare the body for a fight or flight response by increasing heart rate, blood pressure, and energy levels. The endocrine system is seamlessly integrated with other systems. For example, hormones regulate the cardiovascular system by controlling blood vessel constriction, and they influence the digestive system by determining how food is metabolized into energy. This interdependence underlines the importance of maintaining hormonal balance for overall health. Here's a clear and easy-to-understand voiceover script to explain the endocrine system using this image. The endocrine system is a vital part of the human body, consisting of a series of glands located throughout both male and female bodies. These glands work together to produce and release hormones, which act as chemical messengers to regulate various functions. Let's start from the top. In the brain, we have the hypothalamus, which serves as the control center, linking the nervous system to the endocrine system. Just below it is the pineal gland, responsible for regulating sleep patterns through the production of melatonin. Nearby, the pituitary gland, often called the master gland, oversees the release of hormones from other glands, and controls processes such as growth and reproduction. Moving down to the neck, we find the thyroid gland, which regulates metabolism, energy, and growth. Attached to it are the parathyroid glands, which help manage calcium levels in the blood and bones. The thymus, located in the chest, plays an important role in developing the immune system during childhood. Below the ribcage, the adrenal glands, sitting atop the kidneys, release hormones like adrenaline and cortisol. These are crucial for managing stress and controlling blood pressure. The pancreas, located in the abdomen, regulates blood sugar by producing insulin and glucagon, which are essential for energy balance. Lastly, the reproductive glands differ between males and females. In females, the ovaries produce estrogen and progesterone, regulating menstrual cycles and supporting pregnancy. In males, the testes produce testosterone, which is vital for sperm production and developing male characteristics. Together, these glands form a network that ensures our bodies function smoothly, influencing everything from growth and metabolism to stress response and reproduction.
I've invited you all here today because I wanted to talk to you about some ugly stereotypes that are going around. I've been hearing a lot of unfair, unseemly, and unscientific generalizations being made lately, and they mostly have to do with sex. And your hormones. People have a nasty habit of equating hormones with a particular set of behaviors and conditions, most of which have to do with reproduction or sexual development or acts that include what my brother John has referred to as scootily pooping. For example, people will say that hormones are why Kevin has zits and is being all moody, or why Hannah, who's 3 months pregnant, just cried watching a commercial for car insurance, which, let's be honest, I do that too. Now, I'm not saying that hormones aren't at the root of sexual attraction or zits or occasional bouts of extreme emotion, because they are. That's just not all that that they do. Not even close. When people talk about hormones in the context that I just mentioned, what they really mean is sex hormones. But sex hormones are just one kind of hormone that you have coursing through your body right now. In fact, there are at least 50 different types of these chemical messengers at work in your body at this very minute, but only a very few of them have anything at all to do with sex. The truth is, from birth to death, just about every cell and function in your body is under your hormones' constant influence. They're floating through your blood, regulating your metabolism, your sleep cycle, your response to stress, and the general and incredibly important overall homeostasis that keeps you not dead. Some hormones are just there to make other hormones trigger even more hormones in a kind of chemical relay race that biologists refer to rather elegantly as cascades. These hormones run through your body no matter what your mood is or whether you have zits. So the reality is, we are all hormonal all the time. Okay, to begin to understand our hormones and the endocrine system that produces, releases, and reabsorbs them, we have to step back and take a broad view. Not just by emphasizing that sex hormones are not the only hormones you have, but also by looking at how your hormones interact with your other organ systems. Because if anything, your body has two bosses, two complementary systems that are constantly shouting instructions over each other to all your bits and pieces. Both your endocrine system and your nervous system are constantly trafficking information around your corpus, gathering intel, making demands, controlling your every move. They just have totally different ways of doing it. Your nervous system uses lightning-fast electrochemical action potentials delivered by an expressway made of neurons to specific cells and organs. But your endocrine system prefers a slower, wider stream of data. It secretes hormones that travel through your blood, not through neurons, so they move more slowly, but they also produce widespread effects that last a whole lot longer than an action potential. Now, compared to your heart or brain or other arguably more glamorous organs, your endocrine system's organs and glands are kinda small and lumpy. They're also rogues. Instead of being all nestled together like in your other organ systems, these guys are scattered all over the place, from your brain to your throat to your kidneys to your genitals. A gland is just any structure that makes and secretes a hormone, and the master gland in your body is the pituitary, which produces many hormones that signal other glands, like the thyroid, parathyroid, adrenal, and pineal glands, to make their own hormones. The endocrine system also includes a few organs, like the gonads, the pancreas, and the placenta in pregnant women, all of which have some other non-hormonal functions and are made up of multiple tissue types. And technically the hypothalamus in your brain is in the endocrine club too, since in addition to all of its busy brain duties, it does produce and release hormones. So thanks to all these glands and organs, you've got these hormones diffusing through your blood doing all sorts of different things, but the thing to remember about them is that a hormone can only trigger a reaction in specific cells. They're so-called target cells that have the right receptors for it. So just like some keys can open many locks while others only work with one, so too can the hormone-target cell relationship either be widespread or localized. You're probably going to want an example of that, so your thyroid at the bottom of your throat produces the hormone thyroxine, which stimulates metabolism and binds to receptors in most of the cells in your body. But your pituitary, which is nestled all comfy under your brain, produces follicle-stimulating hormone, which helps regulate growth and trigger sexual maturity, and it only targets specific cells in the ovaries and testes. So, how do hormones bind to their target cells? Well, chemically, most hormones are either made of amino acids, including their more complex structures like peptides or proteins, or they're derived from lipids like cholesterol. And this is key because a hormone's chemical structure determines if it's water-soluble, like most amino acid-based ones are, or lipid-soluble, like steroids are. Solubility is important because your cell membranes are made of lipids. That means that water-soluble ones can't get across them, so target cells for those kinds of hormones have receptors on the outside of their membranes. Lipid-soluble hormones, on the other hand, can just basically glide right through that cell membrane, so their receptor sites are inside the target cells. Either way, when a target cell is activated, the hormone alters its activity by either increasing or decreasing some of its functions, usually with the goal of maintaining your body's homeostasis in one way or another. So, if hormones are keeping your body in balance, what's putting your body out of balance? I don't know. Could I interest you in some pie? If you have a couple of nice, generous helpings of strawberry rhubarb pie, and just to make things interesting, let's say they're a la mode, your blood glucose level is gonna go through the roof. And the pancreas regulates your blood sugar by releasing two different hormones, insulin and glucagon. Once you have a belly full of that pie, beta cells in your pancreas release insulin, which helps lower your blood sugar by increasing the rate at which your cells store the sugar either as glycogen or as fat for later use. Now let's say you've done the opposite. You've eaten no pie. Your pileless. In fact, you've eaten nothing for hours. If your blood sugar drops too low, then alpha cells in the pancreas will instead send out glucagon, which helps raise your blood sugar levels, in part by decreasing the storage of sugar in your cells and triggering the release of glucose back into the blood. Lots of different endocrine-related illnesses, like diabetes or hyperthyroidism, tend to be the result of either hyper, too much, or hypo, too little secretion of certain hormones, which throw your homeostasis off balance. But there are lots of more common and less obvious ways your hormones can get out of balance, not because of some disorder, but because these signaling chemicals are just caught up in a chain reaction, which can take a while to subside. Some hormones just exist to control other hormones, which in turn control still more hormones. So as soon as one starts to trickle out, you can pretty quickly wind up with a cascade on your hands. You got a few different hormone cascades going on at any given moment, but one of the big ones, one that's really worth understanding, is the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, or the HPA axis, because you don't want to have to say that every time. This is a complex series of interactions between three glands that ultimately regulates lots of your body's daily processes, like digestion, sexuality, immune response, and how you handle stress. And it's complex not just because of all the glands involved. It's also one of the more crucial instances of your endocrine system coordinating with your nervous system. Specifically, it's behind that fight-or-flight response that everybody keeps talking about. The HPA axis is essentially the endocrine system's companion to the sympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic system, in times of high stress, does things like speed up your heart rate and direct blood away from your digestive organs and to the muscles. But many of the other effects of the stress response are carried out by your endocrine system, and getting your nervous and endocrine systems to work together in times of crisis is where the hypothalamus comes in. It's the hub of where the two systems meet. It keeps tabs on what's going on all over your body, analyzing your blood for signs that something might be off. So let's revisit our fight-or-flight scene from a few lessons ago, the old burning house scenario. So you're sleeping. You're dreaming about petting pandas with Emma Watson or whatever when the smoke alarm goes off. Well, action potentials in your brain trigger neurons in your hypothalamus to release the peptide hormone CRH, or corticotropin-releasing hormone. The CRH makes the very short trip through the bloodstream to the anterior pituitary gland, where, because it is water-soluble, it binds to receptors on the outside of its target cells. There, it triggers the release of adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH. The ACTH travels again through the bloodstream to the adrenal cortices of the adrenal glands on top of your kidneys. When the ACTH binds to receptors on cells in an adrenal cortex, it triggers the release of a frenzy of different freak-out compounds known as glucocorticoid and mineralocorticoid hormones. Typically, these hormones help us deal with day-to-day stress by keeping our blood sugar and blood pressure balanced. But under major stress, like waking up in a burning building stress, these hormones, like cortisol, cause the classic fight-or-flight response, ramping up your blood pressure, dumping glucose into your bloodstream, shutting down non-emergency services like your immune system and sperm and egg development. And guess what? Now that all these stress hormones are pulsing through your blood, the hypothalamus back in the brain senses them. And because its job is to monitor and maintain balance whenever possible, it then stops secreting CRH, which eventually causes the other glands to stop secreting their panic hormones. Now, because this element of the stress response is hormonal rather than electrical, it comes on more slowly than the nervous system part, and it takes longer to subside too, as those stress hormones linger in the blood before being broken down by enzymes. So, we're a long way from teenage crushes and zits and crying over commercials at this point, aren't we? As a lifelong owner of hormones, I hope you'll join me in dispelling the stereotypes that surround these powerful and important chemicals and give them the respect they rightly deserve. Today, we looked at the endocrine system and how it uses glands to produce hormones. These hormones are either amino acid-based and water-soluble, or steroidal and lipid-soluble, and may target many types of cells or just turn on specific ones. We also touched on hormone cascades and how the HPA axis affects your stress response. Thank you to our Headmaster of Learning, Thomas Frank, and to all of our Patreon patrons who help make Crash Course possible through their monthly contributions. If you like Crash Course and you want to help us keep making free educational content for the whole world, you can go to patreon.com/Crash Course. Crash Course is filmed in the Dr. Cheryl C. Kinney Crash Course studio. This episode was written by Kathleen Yale, edited by Blake T. Pastino, and our consultant is Dr. Brendan Jackson. It was directed by Nicholas Jenkins, the editor is Nicole Sweeney, the script supervisor was Stephen Chin, our sound designer is Michael Aranda, and the graphics team is Thought Cafe.
The cardiovascular system is one of the most critical systems in the human body, often referred to as the body's transportation network. Let's break it down. At the center of this system is the heart, a powerful, muscular organ about the size of a clenched fist. The heart pumps blood continuously, ensuring oxygen and nutrients are delivered to every cell while removing waste like carbon dioxide. The blood vessels act as highways for the blood. Arteries carry oxygen-rich blood away from the heart to the rest of the body. Veins bring oxygen-depleted blood back to the heart, while tiny capillaries connect arteries and veins, facilitating the exchange of oxygen, nutrients, and waste products at the cellular level. Then, there's the blood itself, the life-sustaining fluid that flows through this network. It carries oxygen from the lungs to tissues and returns carbon dioxide to the lungs for exhalation. It also transports essential nutrients absorbed from food and collects waste products for elimination. Beyond transportation, the cardiovascular system has additional roles. It helps regulate body temperature by directing blood flow to or away from the skin, depending on the need to cool or conserve heat. It also maintains a stable pH level in the body, ensuring our cells can function properly. In short, the cardiovascular system keeps us alive by ensuring that every part of our body gets the oxygen, nutrients, and support it needs to function effectively. The first diagram depicts the anatomy of the human heart. The heart has 4 chambers: the right atrium, right ventricle, left atrium, and left ventricle. The septum, a wall of muscle, divides the heart into 2 halves. Each chamber plays a critical role in circulating blood throughout the body. Blood enters the heart through the right atrium, moves to the right ventricle, and is then pumped to the lungs for oxygenation. Oxygen-rich blood returns to the left atrium, passes into the left ventricle, and is pumped to the rest of the body through the arteries. Now let's focus on the second diagram. This illustration represents the entire cardiovascular system, highlighting the path blood takes as it circulates through the body. You'll notice 2 distinct colors, red and blue. These represent the oxygenation status of the blood. Red indicates oxygen-rich blood. This blood has been oxygenated in the lungs and is being delivered to the brain, organs, and tissues. Blue indicates oxygen-poor blood. This blood, now carrying carbon dioxide and waste products, is being transported back to the lungs for reoxygenation. Let's trace the journey. Oxygen-poor blood flows into the heart via the veins and is pumped to the lungs through the pulmonary artery, blue pathways. In the lungs, carbon dioxide is exchanged for oxygen. Oxygen-rich blood flows back to the heart via the pulmonary vein and is pumped to the rest of the body via the aorta, red pathways. This continuous cycle ensures that every cell receives oxygen and nutrients while removing waste products. In summary, the red and blue pathways demonstrate the dual function of the cardiovascular system, transporting oxygen to tissues and removing carbon dioxide efficiently. Understanding this system is crucial in recognizing how the heart and blood vessels sustain life. 5.9.1 The heart. The heart, a critical organ, is roughly the size of a clenched fist and pumps an astonishing 4 to 5 liters of blood every minute in a resting adult. This steady pumping action propels blood throughout the cardiovascular system, ensuring oxygen and nutrients are delivered to cells while waste products are removed. The heart operates in tandem with the respiratory system, which replenishes oxygen and expels carbon dioxide, making this partnership essential for life.
Your heart, that throbbing, beating muscle, is probably the most iconic organ in your body. No other organ gets its own holiday or as much radio play, and you're unlikely to get a love note decorated with a kidney or a spleen or even a brain, which is really what rules the emotions. Don't get me wrong, the heart does some great things. Namely, it powers the entire circulatory system, transporting nutrients, oxygen, waste, heat, hormones, and immune cells throughout the body over and over. But in the end, the heart does not make you love, it doesn't break apart if you get dumped by your boo, and it's not a lonely hunter. The truth is, the heart is really just a pump. A big, wet, muscly brute of a pump. And it doesn't care about poetry or chocolate or why you're crying. The heart has only one concern: maintaining pressure. If you've ever squeezed the trigger on a squirt gun or opened a can of shaken soda, you've seen how fluids flow from areas of high pressure, like inside the gun or the can, to areas of low pressure, like outside. The heart's entire purpose is to maintain that same kind of pressure gradient by generating high hydrostatic pressure to pump blood out of the heart while also creating low pressure to bring it back in. That gradient of force is what we mean when we talk about blood pressure. It's basically a measure of the amount of strain your arteries feel as your heart moves your blood around. More than 5 liters of it at about 60 beats per minute. That's about 100,000 beats a day, 35 million a year, 2 to 3 billion heartbeats in a lifetime. The basic physiology of which you can easily feel just by taking your own pulse. I don't have a watch. Now that might not inspire so much poetry, but it turns out it's still a pretty good story. Let us begin with a little anatomy. Unless you happen to be of the Grinch persuasion, the average adult human heart is about the size of 2 fists clasped together. One of the few bits of trivia you often hear about human anatomy that is actually true. The heart is hollow, vaguely cone-shaped, and weighs only about 250 to 350 grams, a pretty modest size for your body's greatest workhorse. And although Americans tend to put their right hand over their left breast while pledging allegiance, the heart is actually situated pretty much in the center of your chest, snuggled in the mediastinum cavity between your lungs. It sits at an angle, though, with one end pointing inferiorly toward the left hip and the other toward the right shoulder, so most of its mass rests just a little bit left of the mid-sternal line. The heart is nestled in a double-walled sac called the pericardium. The tough outer layer, or fibrous pericardium, is made of dense connective tissue and helps protect the heart while anchoring it to some of the surrounding structures, so it doesn't bounce all over the place while it's beating. Meanwhile, the inner serous pericardium consists of an inner visceral layer, or epicardium, which is actually part of the heart wall, and an outer parietal layer. These two layers are separated by a thick film of fluid that acts like a natural lubricant, providing a slippery environment for the heart to move around in so it doesn't create friction as it beats. The wall of the heart itself is made of yet more layers, 3 of them. That epicardium on the outside, the myocardium in the middle, which is mainly composed of cardiac muscle tissue that does all the work of contracting, and the innermost endocardium, a thin white layer of squamous epithelial tissue. Deeper inside, the heart has a whole lot of moving pieces that I'm not going to pick apart here, because the really big thing to understand is how the general system of chambers and valves and veins and arteries all work together to circulate blood around your body. Of course, fluid likes to move from areas of high pressure to areas of low pressure, and the heart creates those pressures. Form, once again, following function. Your heart is divided laterally into 2 sides by a thin inner partition called the septum. This division creates 4 chambers, 2 superior atria, which are the low pressure areas, and 2 inferior ventricles that produce the high pressures. Each chamber has a corresponding valve, which acts like a bouncer at a club at closing time, like he'll let you out, but not back in. When a valve opens, blood flows in one direction into the next chamber, and when it closes, that's it. No blood can just flow back into the chamber it just left. So if you put your ear against someone's chest, and yeah, ask for permission first, you'll hear that lub-dub. Lub-dub. What you're really hearing are the person's heart valves opening and closing. It's a relatively simple but quite elegant setup, really. Functionally, those atria are the receiving chambers for the blood coming back to the heart after circulating through the body. The ventricles, meanwhile, are the discharging chambers that push the blood back out of the heart. As a result, the atria are pretty thin-walled because the blood flows back into the heart under low pressure, and all those atria have to do is push it down into the relaxed ventricles, which doesn't take a whole lot of effort. The ventricles are beastly by comparison. They're the true pumps of the heart, and they need big, strong walls to shoot blood back out of the heart with every contraction. And the whole thing is connected to the rest of your circulatory system by way of arteries and veins. We'll go into a whole lot more detail about these later, but the thing to remember first, if you don't already remember it, is that arteries carry blood away from the heart, and veins carry it back toward the heart. To differentiate the two, anatomy diagrams typically depict arteries in red while veins are drawn in blue, which incidentally is part of what has led to the common misconception that your blood is actually blue at some point, but it isn't. It is always red. It's just a brighter red when there's oxygen in it. So let's look at how all this comes together, starting with a big burst of blood flowing out of your heart. The right ventricle pumps blood through the pulmonary semilunar valve into the pulmonary trunk, which is just a big vessel that splits to form the left and right pulmonary arteries. From there, and this is the only time in your body where deoxygenated blood goes through an artery, the blood goes straight through the pulmonary artery into the lungs where it can pick up oxygen. It finds its way into very small small, thin-walled capillaries which allow materials to move in and out of the bloodstream. In the case of the lungs, oxygen moves in and carbon dioxide moves out. The blood then circles back to the heart by way of 4 pulmonary veins, where it keeps moving to the area of lowest pressure, because that is what fluids do, and in this case, that's the inside of the relaxed left atrium. Then the atrium contracts, which increases the pressure, so the blood passes down through the mitral valve into the left ventricle. So the thing that just happened here, where a wave of blood was pumped from the right ventricle to the lungs and then followed the lowest pressure back to the left atrium, there's a name for that. It is the pulmonary circulation loop. It's how your blood unloads its burden of carbon dioxide into the lungs and trades it in for a batch of fresh oxygen. It's short, it's simple, at least in the way I have time to describe it, and it's just delightfully effective. Of all the substances you need to continue existing, oxygen is the most urgent, the one without which you will die in minutes instead of hours or days or weeks. But it's pretty useless unless the oxygen can actually reach your cells, and that hasn't happened yet. For that, your newly oxygenated blood needs to travel through the rest of your organ systems and share the wealth. And that fantastic journey, known as the systemic loop, begins in the left ventricle when it flexes to increase pressure. Now, the blood would like to flow into the nice low-pressure left atrium where it just came from, but the mitral valve slams shut, forcing it through the aortic semilunar valve into your body's largest artery, nearly as big around as a garden hose, the aorta, which sends it to the rest of your body. And after all your various greedy muscles and neurons and organs and the heart itself have had their oxygen feast at the capillary bed buffet, that now oxygen-poor blood loops back to the heart, entering through the big superior and inferior vena cava veins straight into the right atrium. And when the right atrium contracts, the blood passes through the tricuspid valve into the relaxed right ventricle and right back to where we started. This whole double loop cycle plays out like a giant figure 8, heart to lung to heart to body to heart again, and runs off that constant high pressure, low pressure gradient exchange regulated by the heart valves. So the first lub that you hear in that lub-dub is made by the mitral and tricuspid valves closing. And they do that because your ventricles contract to build up pressure and pump blood out of the heart. This high pressure caused by ventricular contraction is called systole. Now, the dub sound. And just to be clear, I'm not talking about dubstep sounds. That's the aortic and pulmonary semilunar valves closing at the start of diastole. That's when the ventricles relax to receive the next volume of blood from the atria. When those valves close, the high pressure blood that's leaving the heart tries to rush back in, but runs into the valves. So you know when you get your blood pressure measured and the nurse gives you 2 numbers, like 120/80. The first number is your systolic blood pressure, essentially the peak pressure produced by the contracting ventricles that push blood out to all your tissues. The second reading is your diastolic blood pressure, which is the pressure in your arteries when the ventricles are relaxed. These 2 numbers give your nurse a sense of how your arteries and ventricles are doing when they're experiencing both high pressure, the systolic, and low pressure, the diastolic. So if your systolic blood pressure is too low, that could mean that, say, the volume of your blood is too low, like maybe you've lost a lot of blood or you're dehydrated. And if your diastolic is too high, that could mean that your blood pressure is high even when it's supposed to be lower. Considering how much we've talked about the importance of homeostasis, it should come as no surprise that blood pressure that's too high or too low, or anything that affects your blood's ability to move oxygen around, can be dangerous. Prolonged high blood pressure can damage arterial walls, mess with your circulation, and ultimately endanger your heart, your lungs, brain, kidneys, and nearly every part of you. So I guess you could say that the best way to break a heart is to mess with its pressure. But good luck trying to write a song about that. Today you learned how the heart's ventricles, atria, and valves create a pump that maintains both high and low pressure to circulate blood from the heart to the body through your arteries and bring it back to the heart through your veins. We also talked about what systolic and diastolic blood pressure are and how they're measured. Thanks to our headmaster of learning, Thomas Frank, and to all of our Patreon patrons who help make Crash Course possible for free through their monthly contributions. If you like Crash Course and you want to help us keep making these videos and also maybe want to get some cool stuff, you can check out patreon.com/crashcourse. Crash Course is filmed in the Dr. Cheryl C. Kinney Crash Course studio. This episode was written by Kathleen Yale, edited by Blake T. Pastino, and our consultant is Dr. Brandon Jackson. It was directed by Nicholas Jenkins. The script supervisor and editor is Nicole Sweeney. Our sound designer is Michael Aranda, and the graphics team is Thought Cafe. You've seen this before in a TV show or a movie. A patient is on the table in the emergency room bleeding from a stab wound or having OD'd on drugs when suddenly an alarm goes off and the beep 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 of the heart monitor flatlines. It's cardiac arrest, and you can tell just by that sound that it's terrible. Doctors swarm around barking orders, and McDreamy or Dr. Gray or whoever the latest foxy doctor is on the TV show that you're addicted to grabs the paddles and pushes them down on the patient's chest and is all, "Clear!" Then the patient's chest jumps up and everyone stares at the monitor waiting for those steady beeps to reappear. That is a pretty classic scene. When it comes to medical crises you see in popular culture, it's probably only rivaled by the poolside CPR scene or someone shaking an unconscious body, pounding on their chest and saying, "Don't you die on me!" Which, hopefully you know, is no way to keep someone alive. These are classic script tropes, but they contribute to some misconceptions about how defibrillators, CPR, and the electricity of the heart work. Because the truth is, CPR can help prolong heart function during cardiac arrest, but it usually can't save a life without help from a defibrillator. And when McDreamy, may he rest in peace, finally bursts out those paddles, that high voltage shock isn't turning the heart back on, it's actually stopping it. Confused? Well, I am here to get your head to understand your heart. We'll get back to hot TV doctors in a couple of minutes, I promise. But in order to understand what's actually going on during cardiac arrest, we have to understand some basics about your heart cells. We've learned a lot about skeletal muscle tissue, how it's striated and contracts using the actin-myosin sliding filament dance you've heard so much about. Your cardiac muscle is also striated and uses sliding filaments to contract, but the similarities end there. For one, their cells look pretty different. Skeletal muscle tissue has long multinucleate cells, while cardiac cells are squat, branched out, and interconnected, each one with one or two central nuclei. The cells are separated by a loose matrix of connective tissue called the endomysium, which is chock full of capillaries to serve up a constant supply of oxygen. Cardiac cells are also loaded with energy-generating mitochondria. In fact, mitochondria take up as much as 25 to 35% of each cell, making it resistant to fatigue, which is partly why your heart can beat nearly 3 billion times in a lifetime. Not surprisingly, the differences between skeletal and cardiac muscle tissues are key to understanding their functions. Skeletal muscle fibers are both structurally and functionally separate from each other, meaning that some cells can work while others don't. That's why you can grasp a delicate flower with the same hand that you can use to crush a soda can. Cardiac cells, on the other hand, are both physically and electrically connected all of the time. It takes precise coordination to create the high and low pressures required to pump your blood, after all, and cardiac cells need to be linked in order to have that perfect timing. And there's one more thing you need to know about your heart cells. Some of them can generate their own electricity. How in the name of Raymond de Vusons can that be? Well, rewind your brain to when we explored the electrical marvel that is the action potential and how it triggers both neurons and muscle cells. That process started by depolarizing the cell, that is, pushing the cell's membrane potential from negative toward positive past a threshold that triggered voltage-gated ion channels to open. Most cells in your body only depolarize after being triggered by an external stimulus or by a neighboring cell in a long chain reaction of action potentials that's set off by the nervous system. But that is not the case for a special group of cells found only in your heart, ones that can trigger their own depolarization. These are your pacemaker cells. Pacemaker cells are what keep your heart beating at the correct rhythm and ensure that each cardiac muscle cell contracts in coordination with the others, because you don't want your brain to have to send a series of action potentials every time you need your heart to beat. Your brain has got other stuff to do. So pacemaker cells are, in a way, your heart's very own brain, generating the initial spark that sends a current through your heart's internal wiring system, known as the intrinsic cardiac conduction system. This system transmits electricity along a precisely timed pathway that ends with atrial and ventricular contractions, also known as heartbeats. And it begins with pacemaker cells generating their own action potentials. In most cells, the action potential starts with the resting potential, which the cell maintains by pumping sodium ions out and potassium ions in, right? Then, when some stimulus causes the sodium channels to open up, the sodium ions flood back in, which raises the membrane potential until it reaches its threshold. Pacemaker cells operate the same way, except for that initial stimulus. They don't need it. Their membranes are dotted with leaky sodium and potassium channels that don't require any external triggers. Instead, as their channels let sodium ions trickle in, they cause the membrane potential to slowly and inevitably drift toward its threshold. Since the leaking happens at a steady rate, the cells fire off action potentials like clockwork, and the leakier the membrane gets, the faster it triggers action potentials. The pacemaker cells at the start of the conduction system have the leakiest membranes, and therefore the fastest inherent inherent rhythms, so they control the rate of the entire heart. And those fast, leaky cells are found in the sinoatrial node, or the SA node, up in the right atria. They essentially turn the whole SA node into your natural pacemaker. After those pacemaker cells make themselves fire, they spread their electrical impulses to cardiac muscle cells throughout the atria. The impulses leap across synapse-like connections between the cells called gap junctions and continue down the conduction system until they reach the atrioventricular node, or AV node, located just above the tricuspid valve. Now, when the signal hits the AV node, it actually gets delayed for like a tenth of a second, so the atria can finish contracting before the ventricles contract. Without that delay, all the chambers would squeeze at once, and the blood would just splash around and not go anywhere. So instead, the atria contract and blood drops down into the ventricles, and then a moment later, the signal moves on and triggers the ventricles to squeeze, making the blood flow out of the heart. And there are two tricks to a good ventricular contraction. One, the ventricles are so large that the signal has to be distributed evenly to ensure a coordinated contraction. And two, the ventricles need to squeeze like they're squeezing a tube of toothpaste from the bottom up to accelerate the blood through the big arteries at the top of the heart. So from the AV node, the signal travels straight down to the inferior end of the heart and gets distributed to both sides. The path the electrical impulse takes to the bottom of the heart is called the atrioventricular bundle, also known by the more rad name the bundle of His, where it branches out to the left and right ventricles. Finally, the signal disperses out into Purkinje fibers, which trigger depolarization in all surrounding cells, causing the ventricles to contract from the bottom up like toothpaste tubes, at which point the whole cycle starts all over again. And everything I just described to you, from when the SA node fires to when the last of the ventricular cells contract, takes about 220 milliseconds. So that is how your heart beats. But I know what you want. You want to get back to talking about TV shows and McDreamy and his paddles. It's totally understandable. Okay, so picture all your individual heart cells as a bunch of musicians in an orchestra. They all sound really great together, but then the conductor suddenly needs to go to the bathroom. And it sounds okay at first, but then the tuba gets a little weird and the triangles half a beat off, and soon everyone is playing a different note at a different time, jamming to their own personal rhythm. In the heart, we call this out-of-sync behavior fibrillation, and it can be caused by all sorts of problems, especially ones that affect the pacemaker cells in the SA node. In an orchestra, this just sounds really terrible. In a heart, there's no coordinated contraction, no lub-dub, no blood moving through the body, which means you will soon be dead. But then the conductor comes back from the bathroom break, taps her wand, and everybody stops. It's silent for a second before the wand comes up, and then they all start playing again, this time in unison. If your heart in fibrillation is an out-of-sync orchestra, then a defibrillator is that conductor. It stops the chaotic noise by overriding all of the individuals and hits a sort of reset button, so everyone can start again on the same page. The paddles send so much electricity through the heart that they trigger action potentials in all of the cells at once. Then the cells repolarize and start leaking again, and the most leaky cells in the pacemaker SA node reach their threshold and fire first, resetting the rhythm that keeps everyone in harmony so your heart functions properly. And that is how hot doctors and their paddles actually stop hearts to save lives. Now, the thing about CPR, or cardiopulmonary resuscitation, is that it can't correct fibrillation. What those chest compressions can do is force a fibrillating heart to keep circulating oxygenated blood until help arrives. But if a person is in cardiac arrest, just breathing into their mouth and compressing their chest won't deliver the electricity needed to give the pacemaking cells a chance to reset. I think I just figured out why they call those TV doctors heartthrobs. It's a terrible joke. Anyway, today you learned how your heart's pacemaker cells use leaky membranes to generate their own action potentials, and how the resulting electricity travels through the cardiac conduction pathway from SA node to Purkinje fibers, allowing your heart to contract. And if you weren't too busy daydreaming about TV doctors, you also learned how defibrillators work to reset the rhythm of your heart. Thank you to our headmaster of learning, Thomas Frank, and to all of our Patreon patrons who help make Crash Course possible through their monthly contributions, not just to themselves, but to everyone in the world for free. If you like Crash Course and want to help us keep making these videos, you can visit patreon.com/crashcourse. Crash Course is filmed in the Dr. Cheryl C. Kinney Crash Course studio. The episode was written by Kathleen Yale, edited by Blake DiPastino, and our consultant is Dr. Brandon Jackson. It was directed by Nicholas Jenkins. The script supervisor and editor is Nicole Sweeney. Our sound designer is Michael Aranda, and the graphics team is Thought Cafe.
(5.9.2) Blood. Blood is the lifeline of the cardiovascular system, carrying much more than oxygen and carbon dioxide. It transports essential proteins, chemicals, and even microorganisms. The continuous circulation of blood is vital. Without it, oxygen cannot reach cells, causing them to die, and systems throughout the body fail. Blood cells play a crucial role in gas exchange, attaching to oxygen and carbon dioxide molecules, and facilitating their transfer at the lungs. However, significant blood loss can send the body into shock, a condition that can quickly escalate to death without immediate medical intervention. Understanding the components of blood. This image provides a breakdown of the key components of blood, each with a vital role in the human body. 1. Platelets. These small, irregularly shaped cell fragments are crucial for blood clotting. Function. When a blood vessel is injured, platelets gather at the site to form a plug, preventing excessive bleeding. They are essential for wound healing and maintaining the integrity of the circulatory system. 2. White blood cells, WBCs represented in blue. These cells are the body's defense mechanism. Function. White blood cells fight infections by attacking bacteria, viruses, and other foreign invaders. Types of WBCs include neutrophils, lymphocytes, and macrophages, each with a specialized role in immunity. 3. Red blood cells, RBCs shown in red. These cells are the most abundant in blood. Function. Red blood cells carry oxygen from the lungs to the tissues and return carbon dioxide from the tissues to the lungs for exhalation. Their circular, biconcave shape increases surface area, making oxygen exchange highly efficient. 4. Plasma. The yellow liquid in the test tube represents plasma, which makes up about 55% of blood. Function. Plasma is the medium that transports nutrients, hormones, proteins, and waste products throughout the body. It also carries blood cells and plays a role in maintaining blood pressure and volume. Key insight. The layered test tube on the right demonstrates how blood separates when centrifuged. Plasma, top, contains water, electrolytes, and proteins. Buffy coat, middle, a thin layer containing white blood cells and platelets. Red blood cells, bottom, the densest component due to their iron-rich hemoglobin. Together, these components ensure the body receives oxygen, fights infections, clots wounds, and maintains overall health.
Don't take this the wrong way, but you're pretty replaceable. When it comes to your body, science has figured out how to hack, synthesize, or replace a surprising amount of its parts and processes. We have implants to keep heartbeats steady and steel rods to mimic bones. We've got drugs that can replace hormones and antibiotics to cover for your immune system. And pretty soon you'll be able to just 3D print a new ear if you need one, really. But one thing we absolutely cannot manufacture, despite what True Blood would have you believe, is blood. And yet blood is a thing that we all need. And sometimes because of injury or illness, we need extra blood. In fact, every 2 seconds, someone in the US needs a blood transfusion. This could be a victim of a car accident, someone undergoing surgery, or a cancer patient who needs new blood to maintain their health during chemotherapy. And because we can't grow it on trees or make it in a lab or even store it for all that long, the blood that people need, nearly 16 million pints a year in the US, has to come from people who have donated it. So, let's talk blood, shall we? The meal of choice for vampires and female mosquitoes, blood is red, sticky, salty, and kinda metallic tasting. It is indeed thicker than water and super viscous, which is why Hitchcock used chocolate syrup as a stand-in in a certain classic shower scene. For most purposes, blood comes in 8 different types, and it accounts for about 8% of your body weight. You might remember from our episodes on tissues that blood is a type of connective tissue, which means it's made of living cells suspended in a non-living matrix, which in this case is the fluid ground substance called plasma. And of course, one of blood's main missions is to transport and distribute oxygen and nutrients and waste products and hormones around the body. But it also helps maintain and regulate body temperature, pH levels, and the volume of fluids in your body. Plus, it protects you from infection and from the loss of blood itself. Perhaps second only to your brain, your blood is the one component of your body that we haven't figured out how to reproduce, synthesize, or imitate. It's a part of you that is literally irreplaceable. It's Saturday and you feel like doing a good deed, so you head over to your local Red Cross for a blood drive. You get your finger pricked and then somebody directs you toward a lounge chair, swabs your inner elbow with alcohol, and then comes at you with a hollow needle. Once the bag is full, they usually take about a pint, you get unhooked and grab a cookie and a juice to replace the blood sugar you lost, and the whole process takes around 20 minutes. But for your blood, the day is just beginning. Soon it will be taken to a lab where it'll be tested for infectious diseases and separated into different parts before heading out to hospitals. So hold up. What exactly do I mean by different parts? Well, the blood that flows from your arm into that bag is whole blood, a mixture of cells and cell fragments called formed elements along with water and lots of dissolved molecules. A patient who needs a transfusion may only need some of those things and not others, so the parts are separated. Once your blood makes it to a lab, technicians put it in a centrifuge which spins it around fast enough to send the heavier components to the bottom of the tubes and bring the less dense elements to the top. In the centrifuge, 3 distinct layers emerge. Down at the bottom, you got a heavy red layer of erythrocytes, or red blood cells that carry oxygen and carbon dioxide. They make up about 45% of your total blood volume. Then you got this thin little whitish layer in the middle. Those are your warriors, the leukocytes, or white blood cells that defend your body from toxins and foreign microbes. And there are also the cell fragments called platelets, which help with blood clotting and make up less than 1% of your blood. Finally, up at the top, you see the yellowish plasma, which accounts for about 55% of your blood volume. Plasma is actually 90% water, but the other 10% is chock full of 100 different solutes, including proteins, electrolytes, gases, hormones, and waste products. The most abundant of these solutes are electrolytes, which you may have heard of as the secret ingredient in sports drinks, but they're really just positively charged cations like calcium, sodium, and potassium, and negatively charged anions like phosphate, sulfate, and bicarbonate. Together, these ions help regulate your blood's chemistry, maintaining its pH levels and proper osmotic pressure, and allowing other tissues to do their jobs, like making muscles contract and sending action potentials. But when measured by weight, the bulk of the solutes in your blood are really the plasma proteins. Most of these proteins, like albumin and alpha and beta globulins, are made by the liver and do things like balance the osmotic pressure between the blood and surrounding tissues and transport lipids and ions. Others run defense for you, like the gamma globulin antibodies that are released by plasma cells during an immune response, or fibrinogen proteins, which are vital to forming blood clots and stopping bleeding. Alright, bleeding. I want to talk about that. Because for the very reason that I mentioned at the beginning, that we can't replace your blood with some synthetic wonder fluid, the last thing that your circulatory system wants is for you to fritter away your blood in some sidewalk scrape or kitchen accident. So it has a whole system in place to prevent you from losing too much of it through a process known as hemostasis. So imagine you're slicing up a nice garlic cheese bagel one morning and you lacerate the distal phalanx of your pollex. In other words, you cut the tip of your thumb. And now you're bleeding all over your breakfast. At the very first sign of rupture, the blood vessel actually constricts itself to slow the flow of blood through it. Then little cell fragments called platelets gather at the site of the injury, creating a plug that dams the breach and keeps the blood from leaking further. Now, these free-floating platelets don't clump together during regular circulation, that would be terrible, but when the endothelial cells lining a blood vessel wall tear, the underlying collagen fibers are suddenly exposed, and they chemically react with the platelets, turning them all sticky and glue-like at the scene of the injury. But that platelet plug still isn't as strong as it could be. It needs reinforcement to complete the clotting process. This reinforcement comes in the form of fibrin threads, protein strands that join together to make a sort of mesh that traps the platelets and blood cells. Eventually, the threads actually pull the opposite sides of the wound together to close the vessel wall so the endothelial cells can be replaced. Over a few days, the blood vessel heals and the blood clot dissolves, or at least that's how it's supposed to happen. People who suffer from disorders related to hemostasis may have trouble with unwanted clotting or the inability to form clots. In the family of disorders known as hemophilia, a patient can usually complete the first 2 steps of hemostasis just fine, but they can't make an effective fibrin clot. So it's not that they bleed more than anyone else, it's just that they bleed longer, which I guess means that they bleed more. As a result, they may need frequent blood transfusions throughout their lifetime. Which brings me right back around to that Saturday morning blood drive. Another thing you're gonna need to know before you give blood is what type you have. Do you have A, B, AB, or O? These different types all do the job equally well, they just sort of have a different flavor related to your immune system. All the cells in your body have a plasma membrane with specialized glycoprotein markers on them that act like name tags or labels, sort of like, this cell is property of Hank. These markers are your antigens. And your body's immune system is totally fine with your particular antigens, but if it detects antigens from someone else's cells, including viruses or bacteria, then it'll send out antibodies to bind to those markers, often to tag them for destruction by the immune system. Your red blood cells have specialized antigens on them called agglutinogens that activate antibodies that work by binding invading cells to each other, which causes coagulation, or the clumping of blood. Which agglutinogens you have on your erythrocytes defines your blood type, but they're classified in two different ways. In the most important blood classification, the kind people are most familiar with, there are only two kinds of agglutinogens, simply A and B, and your blood can either have one or both or neither of these molecules. So the name of your blood type refers to what kind of agglutinogens you have or don't have. A type has A antigens, B type has B, AB has both, and O has neither. So why do you need to know what type you are before you give or receive blood? Well, like I mentioned, if you have either of these antigens, your body will be fine with it because it doesn't produce any antibodies that label it for attack. So if you don't have a particular antigen on your blood cells, say the type B, then you do have antibodies that are going to label those B antigens for attack should they enter your space. So AB type folks are called universal recipients because they have both antigens and therefore no antibodies for either. So they can accept A or B or AB or O blood. Meanwhile, O type doesn't have A or B antigens, so those folks have antibodies for both. That means that they can only accept other O blood. And yet that lack of antigens means that type O blood can mix with other types of blood without getting attacked, which is why it's known as the universal donor. But just to complicate things a little bit more, you've got a whole other set of antigens with totally different protocol. These are your rhesus or Rh antigens, named after the species of monkey they were first identified in. Much like A and B, you either have the Rh antigens, in which case you're Rh positive, or you don't and are Rh negative. Most of the population is Rh positive, so they don't have the anti-Rh antibodies, which means they can accept either positive or negative blood, but negative types should stick to just the Rh negative blood. And since the presence of AB antigens is controlled by different genes than the Rh ones, we end up with 8 different blood types, 4 separate groups, each with 2 variations. And now, hopefully, you understand why it's so hard to replace blood, and why true blood is not true. I've not actually ever seen that show. Along the way, you also learn the basic components of blood, including erythrocytes, leukocytes, platelets, and plasma, as well as the basic process of hemostasis that stops bleeding, and how antigens are responsible for the blood type that you have. Thanks to all of our Patreon patrons who make Crash Course possible through their monthly contributions. If you like Crash Course and want to help us keep making it for free for everyone in the world, you can go to patreon.com/crashcourse. Also, a big thank you to Brian Drexler for co-sponsoring this episode. Crash Course Anatomy and Physiology is filmed in the Dr. Cheryl C. Kinney Crash Course studio. This episode was written by Kathleen Yale, the script was edited by Blake DiPestino, and our consultant is Dr. Brandon Jackson. It was directed and edited by Nicole Sweeney, the sound design was by Michael Aranda, and our graphics team is Thought Cafe. I feel like I haven't spent nearly enough time lately talking to you about all the stupid and dangerous things that you can do to your own body. So let's talk about doping. You probably have heard of this thanks to Lance Armstrong, who secretly messed with his own blood so that he could illicitly win the Tour de France 7 times in a row. You might be dimly familiar with the fact that doping isn't like shooting steroids, but it is still cheating, even though, like, why is it cheating and how does it work, and is it even possible to make your blood better at being blood? In other words, how can some people treat or mistreat their own blood like it's some sort of drug? Short answer, because your blood is incredibly powerful stuff. And its power rests largely in your erythrocytes, or red blood cells. They're the most abundant type of cell in your blood, accounting for nearly 45% of its volume. Every time you take a breath, they pick up oxygen in your lungs and distribute it through your body, and then grab carbon dioxide and bring it back to the lungs where it can be exhaled. The main mission of erythrocytes is to keep your body fed with oxygen so your muscles can do their thing and your brain can continue to think and feel and boss around your various parts. But you don't want to mess around with your red blood cells because erythrocytes are weird characters. They go places that other cells won't. They purge themselves of their most precious inner belongings, preferring instead to live as hollow shells. Because of the crushing demands of their job, they don't live very long, and just like with your blood pressure, too much of these good things can turn bad quickly. So the erythrocyte must be respected. It is not for doping or for dopes. Despite their prominent role in some international sports scandals, your red blood cells are fairly simple and unassuming little cells. They've got a distinct biconcave shape, which just means that they're concave on both sides, making them look kinda like a breath mint. A tiny, bloody breath mint. And while they do have a plasma membrane, they don't have a nucleus and don't have most of the parts that other cells do. So they're basically just glorified protein-filled phospholipid bilayer sacs. But there's still another great example of that harmony between form and function. For one thing, that biconcave shape gives them a large surface area that's ideal for gas exchange. It also makes them flexible and able to change shape as they squeeze through tiny capillaries with diameters smaller than the cell itself. Of course, all that squeezing and twisting is hard on a cell's membrane, and that, combined with their general lack of organelles to help repair the membrane, means these cells don't live very long, surviving on average only 120 days. But they sure work hard while they're alive. And their work is mostly in gathering and transporting oxygen. They're able to do this because if you don't count their water content, red blood cells are 97% hemoglobin, a molecule that easily binds to and releases oxygen. It's like an oxygen sponge. Every hemoglobin molecule is really made of 8 different component molecules. 4 are a red pigment called heme, and 4 are a protein called, you guessed it, globin. Each globin is a globular polypeptide chain, hence its name, and proteins, you'll probably remember, like to bind to stuff. So each globin has its own personal ring-shaped heme molecule, and in the center of that heme is an iron atom, kind of like a cherry on top of a protein and pigment sundae. It's that iron in the center of the heme that makes our blood red. Incidentally, not all animals have red blood, because not all animals use hemoglobin to move oxygen. For example, most mollusks like squids and snails have blue blood because it contains hemocyanin, a copper-rich protein pigment that turns blue when exposed to oxygen. But iron is what we're stuck with, and I have to say it's great at its job because each iron can bind with one whole oxygen molecule. And that oxygen really adds up. Since you have 4 iron atoms in every molecule of hemoglobin, and every red blood cell contains something like 250 million hemoglobin molecules, that means that each one of your tiny floppy red breath mints can grab about 1 billion molecules of oxygen. Exactly how they transfer oxygen and carbon dioxide from your tissue cells is something that we'll get into more when we talk about the respiratory system. But if you're wondering why all this hemoglobin can't simply skip the red blood cell rigmarole and just run around naked in your blood, it's because free-range hemoglobin would actually thicken the blood, making it so viscous that it would impede blood flow. This also happens to play a part in blood doping, which, stick with me, I will explain in a bit. So what does the brief but glorious 4-month life of an erythrocyte look like? Well, remember when I said that a red blood cell doesn't have a nucleus? And maybe you thought, hey, wait a second, how can it even be a cell without a nucleus, or DNA? First of all, nice catch. But actually, erythrocytes do start off with a nucleus and DNA, they just get rid of them because their entire purpose for existing is to schlep around hemoglobin and oxygen, and they want the extra room. The whole process of forming red blood cells, called hematopoiesis, happens in your red bone marrow, which is mostly made of reticular connective tissue that's snuggled up to special capillaries called blood sinusoids. In short, the process begins with a hemocytoblast, or a specialized stem cell, which soon differentiates into an early erythroblast. Then it starts making a whole bunch of ribosomes, the organelles that manufacture proteins. And in this case, the ribosomes start cooking up tons of hemoglobin as the cell transforms into a late-stage erythroblast. When it's got enough hemoglobin, it suddenly jettisons most of its organelles, which causes the cell walls to collapse a little, giving it its biconcave, bloody breath mint shape. Now you're left with a reticulocyte, which is pretty much just an early erythrocyte that still has a little group of ribosomes left called a reticulum. So far, this whole journey has taken about 15 days. When the reticulocyte is finally just about bursting with hemoglobin, then it leaves the marrow and enters the bloodstream, and a couple of days later, when the last of the ribosomes have degraded, you've officially got yourself a mature red blood cell. And that cell travels around your body doing its job for a few months before it gets old or damaged and needs to be replaced. Now, maintaining the balance between production and destruction of these cells is crucial. Too many will make the blood too viscous and difficult to pump, and too few leads to oxygen deprivation, or hypoxia. The process of maintaining the right levels of red blood cells is regulated by a special hormone called erythropoietin, or EPO. It's produced mostly in the kidneys, but also in the liver, and is constantly circulating in the blood. If you're anemic, or hiking at high altitude, or hemorrhaging blood, or experiencing anything else that creates a drop in your blood oxygen levels, certain cells in your kidney will take notice and take action. And they can do that because they traffic in a signaling molecule called hypoxia-inducible factor, which monitors your blood's levels of oxygen. The way that this works is pretty cool. These special kidney cells need oxygen in order to break down that signaling molecule. So if oxygen levels in the blood are low, they can't turn the signal off. This means that the signal keeps going, which triggers the release of more and more EPO, which stimulates your red bone marrow to pump out more red blood cells to carry around more oxygen. As oxygen levels in your blood increase, the signal is degraded and EPO production slows. And EPO is a key player in blood doping too, but we're gonna have to wait a minute before we get there because I first want to get back to the fate of your hardworking erythrocytes. So if you're generating around 2 million new blood cells every second, you also have to dispose of about the same number of dead ones to maintain the balance, right? When these cells get old, they turn rigid and their hemoglobins start to fall apart. As they get stiffer, they can end up getting stuck in capillaries in your brain or heart, which would not be good. Luckily, you have certain channels to corral these dying cells, especially around the spleen, which some anatomists call
the red blood cell graveyard.
So these tired old cells get trapped and then basically ambushed by big macrophage white blood cells in the spleen, liver, and bone marrow, which break them down and recycle their various components. The globin proteins are broken down into their basic components, amino acids, which go back into the blood to be used by other cells for making more proteins. Iron from the heme group is separated and either bound to proteins and stored in the liver or put right back into a new hemoglobin molecule, and the heme gets turned into bilirubin, a yellowish pigment that goes to the liver where it's added to the bile that it secretes into the intestine and eventually leaves the body in your poop. Now that you know how your erythrocytes function naturally, it's easier to see how they can be messed with, often with bad results. You can dope your blood in a few different ways, but the most common technique is to inject natural or synthetic EPO hormone to boost your red blood cell production. It's also possible to draw and store some of your own blood and then transfuse it back into your body after it's recovered from the blood loss, effectively raising your volume of red blood cells. The logic, if you can call it that, is that more red blood cells equals more oxygen being carried to your muscles, and therefore better physical performance. Now, the extra oxygen can't change your actual muscle strength, but the added aerobic capacity does reduce muscle fatigue and enhance endurance by allowing your muscles to work harder for longer. And it can provide enough of an extra edge to win a race, like say the Tour de France. 7 times. But not only is it banned in athletic competitions, blood doping is also dangerous. Because remember, a red blood cell count that's too high thickens the blood, and that actually makes it harder for the heart to pump blood around the body. In addition to defeating the purpose of enhancing the blood's effectiveness, this can lead to blood clots and strokes and heart failure. So no thank you. Plus, cheating sucks. But today you learned about the structure and function of your erythrocytes and of hemoglobin, which they use to carry oxygen. We also went through the formation and life cycle of a red blood cell and studied how their levels are regulated by EPO and their signaling molecules. Finally, we learned how doping the blood is a recipe for disaster and for finding yourself on Oprah and apologizing to everyone you know and losing all of your yellow jerseys. Thanks to all of our Patreon patrons who help make Crash Course possible for themselves and for everyone for free with their monthly contributions. If you like Crash Course and want to help us keep making videos like this one, you can go to patreon.com/crashcourse. This episode was filmed in the Dr. Cheryl C. Kinney Crash Course studio. It was written by Kathleen Yale. The script was edited by Blake DiPestino, and our consultant is Dr. Brandon Jackson. It was directed and edited by Nicole Sweeney. Our sound designer is Michael Aranda, and the graphics team is Thought Cafe.
5.9.3 Blood vessels. Blood vessels are the highways of the circulatory system, and they come in 3 main types: arteries, veins, and capillaries. Arteries have thick walls to manage high-pressure blood flow, carrying oxygenated blood away from the heart. Veins, with thinner walls and lower pressure, return deoxygenated blood back to the heart. Capillaries are tiny, thin-walled vessels that bridge the gap between arteries and veins, facilitating nutrient and gas exchange with cells. Interestingly, pulmonary vessels break the norm. Pulmonary arteries carry deoxygenated blood to the lungs, while pulmonary veins bring oxygen-rich blood back to the heart. Each vessel type is uniquely adapted to its specific function, ensuring seamless circulation throughout the body. Arteries, veins, and capillaries. This image represents the 3 main types of blood vessels in the circulatory system: arteries, veins, and capillaries. Each plays a crucial role in transporting blood throughout the body. Arteries, red structure, thick-walled and elastic to handle high-pressure blood flow. Function: carry oxygenated blood away from the heart to the tissues and organs of the body. High pressure ensures efficient delivery of oxygen and nutrients. Special note: pulmonary arteries are an exception as they carry deoxygenated blood to the lungs for oxygenation. Veins, blue structure, thinner walls with valves to prevent backflow due to lower pressure. Function: carry deoxygenated blood back to the heart after oxygen and nutrients are delivered to the tissues. The one-way valves ensure smooth blood flow even against gravity, especially in the legs. Special note: pulmonary veins carry oxygenated blood from the lungs to the heart, reversing the usual role of veins. Capillaries, net-like structure, extremely thin walls, 1 cell thick, to allow exchanges between blood and tissues. Function: facilitate the exchange of oxygen, carbon dioxide, nutrients, and waste products between blood and body cells. Serve as the connecting point between arteries and veins, forming a network throughout tissues. Operate at low pressure to enable efficient diffusion. Key insight: the color coding, red for arteries and blue for veins, symbolizes the oxygenation status of the blood. Red, oxygen-rich blood. Blue, oxygen-depleted blood. The intricate design of capillaries ensures that every cell in the body receives the oxygen and nutrients it needs while removing waste products effectively. This network exemplifies the efficiency of the cardiovascular system in maintaining life.
No doubt about it, your heart is a champion. It electrifies itself, it maintains your blood pressure, it keeps your blood moving, and it's got like a nice shape you can put some chocolates inside of and give to people you like. But the circulatory system is much, much more than just that pump, because the heart also needs a network to actually send all that blood through, right? Cue the blood vessels. Although it's easy to think of them as a glorified plumbing system for your body, that's not a very good analogy. These aren't just passive tubes made merely to carry liquid around like the pipes behind your walls at your home. Blood vessels are actually active, dynamic organs capable of contracting and expanding as they deliver oxygen and nutrients to cells throughout the body, carry away waste products, and do their part in maintaining that all-important blood pressure. You already know about the 3 major types of blood vessels: the arteries that carry blood away from the heart, the veins that bring it back, and the little capillaries that act as the transfer station between the two. But you've also got arterioles, which are like mini arteries that branch out into those capillaries, and venules, the smallest vein component that suck blood back out of the capillaries and merge into the larger veins that head home to the heart. And it's quite an incredible journey, really. If all your blood vessels could be strung together in a single line, they'd stretch out for 100,000 kilometers. That's like, and then carry the 2. It's like 2.5 times around the Earth. And together, this extensive network forms a closed system that begins and ends at the heart. That means that all 5 or so liters of blood in your body are contained within it at all times, unless you're bleeding, which I hope you're not. If you prick a finger and watch a drop of blood pop up, you know that you've nicked a blood vessel, and that blood is leaking out of its closed system. Likewise, if you slam your shin against the corner of a coffee table on your way to the bathroom, and an hour later you see a big nasty bruise forming, then you know you've damaged your blood vessels again, because bruising is internal bleeding, usually into loose connective tissue. And if you're embarrassed about that shriek that you let out when you bumped your leg and you start to blush, well, that's your blood vessels too, expanding, just to say hello. Blood vessels are another great example of how anatomy and physiology go together like peanut butter and jelly. How they look and what they do go hand in hand. Most of your blood vessels share a similar structure consisting of 3 layers of tissue surrounding the open space or lumen that actually holds the blood. Anatomists call these layers tunics, and the innermost section is called the tunica intima, which should be pretty easy to remember because, you know, it's like has intimate contact with the lumen. It's like your circulatory underpants. The cool thing about this layer is that it contains the endothelium, which you may remember is made up of simple squamous epithelium tissue and is continuous with the lining of the heart. These cells form a slick surface that helps the blood move without friction. Surrounding the tunica intima is the middle layer, the tunica media, which is made of smooth muscle cells and sheets of the protein elastin. That smooth muscle tissue is regulated in part by the nerve fibers of the autonomic nervous system, which can decrease the diameter of the lumen by contracting this middle layer during vasoconstriction or expand it by relaxing during vasodilation. That right there should tell you that the tunica tunica media plays a key role in blood flow and blood pressure because the smaller the diameter of the blood vessel, the harder it is for blood to move through it. Kinda like trying to drink milk through a cocktail straw versus a soda straw. And finally, the outermost layer of your blood vessels is the tunica externa. It's like an overcoat if that coat were made mostly of loosely woven collagen fiber. Actually, if your coat happens to be made of leather, it is made of collagen, and like a coat, this outer layer is what protects and reinforces the whole blood vessel. Now, the ratio of the thicknesses of these three layers varies between blood vessels of different types, because guess what? Yes, form follows function. Let's take a look. Say you're gearing up for a big tournament of thumb wrestling, or what has been called the miniature golf of martial arts. How does blood move through your systemic circulatory loop to get from your heart to your champion right thumb flexing muscle, the flexor pollicis brevis, and back again? Well, you will remember from our lessons on the heart that blood leaves the left ventricle through the aorta, the biggest and toughest artery in your body, roughly the diameter of a garden hose. The aorta and its major branches are elastic arteries. They contain more elastin than any other blood vessel type, so they can absorb the large pressure fluctuations as blood leaves the heart. What's more, that elasticity actually dampens that pressure so that big surges don't reach the smaller vessels where they could cause damage. This is really where that whole pipe analogy falls apart. These arteries are really more like balloons. Their pressure reservoir is able to expand and recoil with every heartbeat. If they were rigid like pipes, they'd eventually leak or burst after being battered by so many waves of pressure. So that blood leaves your aorta, and since it's heading to your thumb, it travels along the elastic subclavian artery, which gives way to a series of muscular arteries, in this case the brachial artery in your upper arm and the radial artery in the lower arm. Muscular arteries distribute blood to specific body parts and account for most of your named arteries. They're less elastic and more muscular. These arteries invest in additional smooth muscle tissue and proportionally have the thickest tunica media of any blood vessel. This allows them to contract or relax through vasoconstriction and vasodilation, which we've talked about a lot in terms of the nervous system's stress response. These arteries keep tapering down until they turn into the nearly microscopic arterioles that feed into the smallest of your blood vessels, your tiny, extremely thin-walled capillaries, which serve as a sort of exchange or bridge between your arterial and venous systems. They may be little, but your capillaries are where the big important exchange of materials actually happens. Capillary walls are made of just a single layer of epithelial tissue, which form only the tunica intima, so they're able to deliver oxygen and other nutrients in your blood to their cellular destinations through diffusion. The capillaries are also where those cells can dump their carbon dioxide and other waste back into the blood and send it away, through the veins to the lungs and kidneys, but we'll come back to that in a second. Unlike arteries and veins, capillaries don't operate on their own, but rather form interweaving groups called capillary beds. Besides exchanging nutrients and gases, your capillary beds also help regulate blood pressure and play a role in thermoregulation. Say you're in the room where you're practicing your thumb calisthenics, which probably isn't the thing, but the room is a little chilly, so the blood feeding your dermis loses a lot of heat to that cold air. Well, smooth muscle forms tiny sphincters, yeah, you got sphincters everywhere, around the vessels that lead to each of your capillary beds. When they tighten up, they force blood to bypass some of those capillaries, which means less blood is exposed to the cold, and you lose less heat. If it's really cold, the smooth muscles around your larger arterioles and muscular arteries, like that radial artery in your lower arm, will also squeeze, slowing blood flow to your whole hand, which is no way to win at thumb wrestling. But it's one reason why your fingers get all stiff and numb in the cold. They're not getting as much warm blood because your blood vessels are trying to conserve heat. Conversely, if your thumb is working really hard and producing heat from all that exertion, those capillary sphincters relax and open wide, flooding the capillary bed with blood to help disperse heat, which is part of the reason that you might get red-faced when you're hot or exercising hard. So anyway, now your thumb muscles have just feasted on a batch of oxygen and glucose served up on a fresh bed of capillary, and they're ready to take out the trash. The cells send their CO2 and other junk out to the venal end of the capillary exchange, where the capillaries unite into venules and then merge into veins that head back to the heart. Remember that the pressure in these vessels has to be dropping, since fluids always flow from higher to lower pressure. But since the pressure is so low in your veins, it's like 1/12 of the pressure in your arteries, there isn't much pressure gradient left to push the blood back to your heart. So veins require some extra adaptations to keep the blood moving in the right direction. That's why some of them, especially veins in the arms and legs that have to work against gravity, have venous valves that help keep the blood from flowing backward. If those valves leak or a vein experiences too much pressure, the backflow of blood can stretch and twist the vein, leaving you with varicose veins, or if this happens in another part of the body, hemorrhoids. But anyway, we've gotten pretty far from your thumb at this point. We got a loop to finish here. From the capillaries and venules in your thumb, that low-pressure blood flows from the radial vein to the brachial vein to the subclavian vein, where it dumps into the superior vena cava and settles for a second second in the right atria before dropping into the right ventricle. From there, it's sent to the lungs where it gets oxygenated and then comes back into the left atria before sliding down into the left ventricle where it builds up pressure again and spurts back out into your aorta. It takes about a minute for all the blood in your body to complete that circuit, which means even if you're mostly at rest, your hard-working circulatory system moves about 7,500 liters of blood through your heart every day. Just in the time that you've been sitting there listening to me, probably about 52 liters has coursed through. So yes, much like the internet, your blood vessels are more than just a series of tubes. During the time that you've been circulating all that blood, you learned about the basic three-layer structure of your blood vessels, how those structures differ slightly in different types of vessels, and you followed the flow of blood from your heart to capillaries in your right thumb and all the way back to your heart again. If you like Crash Course and you want to help us keep making videos like this, you can go to patreon.com/crashcourse. Also, a big thank you to Matthew Pierce for co-sponsoring this episode of Crash Course Anatomy and Physiology. This episode of Crash Course was filmed in the Dr. Cheryl C. Kinney Crash Course studio. It was written by Kathleen Yale, edited by Blake T. Pastino, and our consultant is Dr. Brandon Jackson. It was directed by Nicholas Jenkins, the editor and script supervisor is Nicole Sweeney, our sound designer is Michael Aranda, and the graphics team is Thought Cafe. Why is everybody so worried about high blood pressure? I mean, of all the millions of things that could go fatally wrong in your body at any given moment, it doesn't seem like the biggest threat you face is that your blood might be pumping a little too hard. A heartbeat that's too strong, isn't that like an awesome song that's played too loud, or nachos with too much cheese? Well, no. The fact is, you're more likely to die from diseases related to your cardiovascular system than anything else. And probably you would like to know why. Well, we know that blood pressure is the circulatory system's way of getting your 5 liters of blood flowing throughout your body so that your tissues can get the oxygen and nutrients they need. But chronic high blood pressure, or hypertension, can cause serious damage to both the heart that creates the high pressure and to the blood vessels that have to withstand that extra pressure. Over time, the increased force of blood against the arterial walls can make them stiffen, leak, or rupture, while the heart itself may simply wear out from all the extra work it's doing to keep blood moving. Luckily, your nervous and endocrine systems have some tricks to try and balance blood pressure when it gets too high or too low in an effort to create homeostatic balance. But even with these defenses in place, if your blood pressure stays out of balance long enough, things will start going really, really wrong. 1 in 3 adults in the US has high blood pressure. That's 2 in 6. That's 3 in 9. And often there are no symptoms until it's too late. Just like your favorite song turned up to 11 or an unlimited supply of nacho cheese, even your own life-giving blood can become too much of a good thing. Part of what might seem confusing about high blood pressure is the seemingly random list of things that can contribute to it, some of which are easier to control than others. There's emotional stress, physical exertion, dehydration, too much salt on your mashed potatoes, too much butter on your bacon. Why are we buttering bacon? But all these things can in some way affect how efficiently your blood flows. But in order to understand why your heart hates French fries, you first have to understand how blood flow works. When we talk about blood flow, what we're talking about is the volume of blood flowing through any given vessel or through the circulatory system as a whole per minute. This is also called cardiac output, and it's determined by the blood volume pumped during one beat and the number of beats per minute. Now, if you ever used a garden hose or fixed a leaky sink or had any other hands-on experience with fluids, then you know that flow can change in response to a number of factors, especially those that affect resistance. Resistance is just anything that hinders flow or creates friction. In the case of your blood, resistance can be the result of increased viscosity. The thicker your blood is, the harder it is to move, or it could be because of increased vessel length, since longer vessels are more resistant to flow in general, but those factors tend to be pretty constant in your body over time. Instead, for most people, the biggest factor that affects resistance has to do with vessel diameter. Changes in diameter can be temporary, like during vasoconstriction or vasodilation, when the diameter increases or decreases, allowing more or less blood through. But an excess of low-density lipoprotein, or LDL, the so-called bad cholesterol in the blood, can build up to form a fatty plaque on the inside of your arteries, permanently increasing the resistance and hindering blood flow. flow. So your blood pressure, blood flow, and resistance are all tied together. In fact, they're so closely and predictably tied together that we can even express their relationship mathematically. Among the truths contained in this equation is the fact that blood flow increases as the difference in blood pressure between 2 points increases. Remember, the ventricles of the heart create very high pressure, while the atria, or the receiving chambers of the heart, have very little pressure, at least while the body's at rest. So the bigger the gap is between the high pressure in your ventricles and aorta and the low pressure in your vena cava and atria, the faster a liter of blood will flow through your system. If you have to back up a few times to review that, nobody's gonna judge you. Now, at the same time, blood flow decreases as resistance increases. So with a little algebraic rearranging, you can see that blood pressure equals blood flow, or cardiac output, times resistance. In theory, this means that any change in resistance or cardiac output would also change blood pressure. But when any one of these variables actually does change, your body tries its best to compensate for it in its eternal quest to maintain homeostasis. And it accomplishes this in a few different ways, mainly using neurons, hormones, and the kidneys. One major short-term fix to wonky blood pressure comes from your brain, which targets both cardiac output and resistance by altering the distribution of blood flow around the body or by changing the diameter of certain blood vessels. This comes in handy when you're walking up 14 flights of stairs in your apartment building with 3 bags of groceries. The vessels feeding your digestive organs constrict, which increases resistance there, so more blood goes to the skeletal muscles in your legs. Most neural responses like this use baroreceptors, special nerve endings found in the carotid arteries, the aorta, and other larger arteries in the neck. When blood pressure stretches arterial walls, that opens up mechanically gated sodium channels in these little receptors. The higher the blood pressure is, the more frequently they send action potentials to the midbrain, informing it just how much pressure the artery is feeling. When the brain learns what's happening, it can do any number of things to correct the situation, like dilate some arterioles to reduce resistance, or reduce the heart rate to lower cardiac output, and these things work pretty well for a while. But baroreceptors are not effective for long-term pressure changes, in part because they end up adapting, essentially reprogramming themselves to read a high blood pressure as the new normal. Now, other short-term effects on your blood pressure come from your hormones. We've already talked about one classic example, and your body actually needs a little high blood pressure, like when it has to get ready to fight or flee. The adrenal medulla starts flooding your blood with epinephrine and norepinephrine. These hormones raise both the heart rate and the blood volume, and therefore cardiac output, while also constricting vessels in less essential regions, increasing the overall resistance and therefore pressure. And again, just like with neural controls, these hormonal controls work by changing vessel resistance and cardiac output. But the way to get more long-term control of blood pressure is to alter the blood volume, and for that, you need the kidneys. Your kidneys cook up hormones like renin and angiotensin, which help regulate levels of sodium and fluids in your body, and also help expand and constrict blood vessels. And when your blood pressure gets too high, your kidneys will try to reduce the volume of blood by getting rid of any extra water. Basically, they make you pee. Blood volume, by the way, is partly why sodium is the root of all evil in blood pressure treatments. The excess sodium used in processed foods and salty snacks causes your body to retain water, which creates higher blood volume and leads to higher blood pressure, which, you know, is a bummer. So those are some of your body's automatic solutions for high blood pressure. But how it compensates for sustained high blood pressure will almost certainly lead to trouble, either for the heart that has to work harder to overcome the resistance, or for the vessels that have to take that extra pressure. An increase in either blood flow or resistance leaves the heart struggling to do its job, so it might actually build more muscle around that left ventricle to help generate the force needed to move the blood. Now, a more muscly heart might not sound like a bad thing, but trust me, it is. Why? Well, because more muscle needs more oxygen, and your body just can't create new blood vessels to feed that supersized ventricle, so that big muscle is left starving. It's literally a hungry heart. Plus, if you have cholesterol plaques in your arteries, then you probably have them in your coronary arteries, which carry oxygen and nutrients to the heart muscle itself. That increases the resistance and therefore decreases blood flow to the heart muscle, so you have this bigger, hungrier heart muscle, but its nutrient supply is diminished, and eventually, those heart muscle cells can slowly die. When that happens, it's known as heart failure. Or if you completely block one of those coronary arteries with plaque or maybe a blood clot, a whole bunch of heart cells quickly starve to death. And that can lead to a myocardial infarction, which is what we also call a heart attack. And then we got the problems on the blood vessel end. Under sustained hypertension, you may see your otherwise elastic arteries go from being flexible balloons to stiff, hardened pipes in what's called arteriosclerosis. Or the high blood pressure may make them weak and bulgy in spots until they're stretched too thin and leak or burst. And that is an aneurysm. And if the weak spot ruptures in a smaller arterial blood vessel, say one that leads to an organ like a kidney or eye, it can lead to organ damage or failure. So although having a huge, strong flow of blood coursing through your body might sound like some kind of comic book caliber superpower, it is not. It's just too much of a good thing. That's why you just learned first and foremost that you should not butter your bacon, and also what blood flow and resistance are and how they relate in direct proportion to blood pressure. We also looked at your body's short-term responses to high blood pressure, including neural, hormonal, and kidney response, and wrapped up by describing all of the ways that chronic high blood pressure can kill you. If you like Crash Course and want to help us keep making videos like this one, you can go to patreon.com/crashcourse. This episode was filmed at the Dr. Cheryl C. Kinney Crash Course studio. It was written by Kathleen Yale, edited by Blake T. Pestino, and our consultant is Dr. Brandon Jackson. It was directed and edited by Nicole Sweeney, our sound designer is Michael Aranda, and the graphics team is Thought Cafe.
The heart is critical for sustaining life by pumping blood throughout the body, delivering oxygen, and removing waste. To function properly, it must beat in a regular, steady rhythm. However, when the heart enters a state of fibrillation, its rhythm becomes erratic, and blood circulation halts. At this point, an automated external defibrillator, or AED, is used to reset the heart's rhythm. If the heart stops altogether, CPR becomes vital. By manually mimicking the pumping action of the heart, CPR helps circulate blood to maintain organ function. Equally concerning is insufficient blood circulation due to major blood loss. Arteries, which carry oxygen-rich blood, operate under high pressure. When ruptured, they bleed heavily, requiring immediate medical attention to prevent life-threatening complications. 5.10 The lymphatic system. The lymphatic system is the body's drainage and immune defense system. During daily activities, a watery liquid known as lymph accumulates around cells. This liquid is drained into lymphatic capillaries, which are closely connected to the cardiovascular system. From here, lymph moves through specialized vessels and nodes. Lymph nodes, often found in areas like the neck and armpits, harbor white blood cells and antibodies. These elements are essential for identifying and neutralizing harmful pathogens. In essence, the lymphatic system not only maintains fluid balance but also serves as a frontline defense mechanism for the immune system. Lymph capillaries in the tissue spaces. This diagram illustrates the relationship between lymphatic vessels, capillaries, and the surrounding tissue spaces, showcasing the lymphatic system's role in fluid balance and immune defense. Here's a breakdown of the key components. Tissue cells and tissue spaces. Tissue spaces are the gaps between cells where interstitial fluid accumulates. This fluid, composed of nutrients, oxygen, and waste, is derived from the blood in the capillaries. Arteriole and venule. The arteriole, red structure, carries oxygen-rich blood into the capillary network. The venule, blue structure, transports deoxygenated blood back to the heart and lungs for reoxygenation. Tissue fluid. Blood from the arteriole seeps through capillary walls into tissue spaces, forming tissue fluid. This fluid nourishes surrounding cells and collects waste products. Lymph capillaries. These thin-walled green vessels absorb the excess fluid from tissue spaces. Once inside the lymphatic system, this fluid is called lymph. Lymph capillaries have unique structures that allow fluid, proteins, and immune cells to enter but prevent backflow. Lymphatic vessel. Lymph capillaries drain into larger lymphatic vessels, which transport the lymph to lymph nodes, and eventually return it to the bloodstream. These vessels play a crucial role in maintaining fluid balance and immune surveillance. Directional flow. Arrows on the diagram indicate the movement of fluid. From the arteriole into tissue spaces. From the tissue spaces into lymph capillaries and lymphatic vessels. Towards venules to re-enter the bloodstream or lymphatic pathways for filtration. Summary. This process highlights the lymphatic system's role in recovering excess tissue fluid, filtering out pathogens, and ensuring that essential nutrients are available to the body's tissues. It bridges the cardiovascular system, arterioles and venules, and immune defense, providing a seamless balance between fluid exchange and protection against infections.
Let's say you're at the airport. You're waiting in line to get through security. You're in your socks, in public, and you're wrestling with those plastic bins, and people are yelling at you about dumping liquids and taking your laptop out of your bag. But even with a certain amount of chaos, the line moves pretty quickly. I mean, it should, theoretically, because really everyone has the same goal, to get to where they need to be. Now, you probably think at this point that I'm setting you up to talk about stress or anxiety or something, but I am not. Instead, I want you to imagine that security line is being like your blood, moving through your high-pressured circulatory system. And you, my friend, are not just some impatient traveler in a hurry to catch the next plane to Seattle. You are a bit of blood plasma. And the biggest concern of everyone in your queue is just to get delivered to their destination. But the problem with rushing stuff through a blood vessel or through a security line is that if it moves too fast, you run the risk that something bad might get through. So in the case of the line at the airport, every now and then, the security people funnel some random folks over to a slower line for a full pat down and a bag check. And that is kind of what your lymphatic system does. It takes up some extra fluid, and while it's ultimately helping it get to its destination, it runs a background check to make sure it's legit. It may not be as well known as some of your other more popular organ systems, but your lymphatic system quietly plays a vital supporting role to both your cardiovascular and immune systems. For one thing, it maintains your homeostasis by eventually returning most of the fluid that has been diverted back into your blood. Which is good, because if it didn't, your ankles would swell up like balloons, your lungs would fill with fluid, and your blood volume and pressure would drop to the point where your body would just give up and you would die. But the lymphatic system isn't just another security line. It also has a series of checkpoints that are staffed by special security officers that have the ability to take care of small infections on the spot. Or if they really don't like the looks of what they've found, they can alert the whole immune system to take it down. So for keeping your blood volume levels where they need to be, for keeping you from collapsing from low blood pressure, and for preventing you from dying from a staph infection every time you scrape your elbow, you have to thank the unsung hero of your anatomy, your lymphatic system. Structurally speaking, your lymphatic system consists of three main parts. The first is just your lymph. It's a watery fluid that flows through your lymphatic system. Much of your lymph starts out as blood plasma that gets forced out of your capillaries, way down in the capillary beds, where the leakage helps the exchange of nutrients and gases between the blood and the capillaries and the hungry cells in your tissues. The blood capillaries reabsorb some of the fluid, but a lot gets left behind. So much of the rest of your lymphatic system works to soak it up and get it back to where it needs to go, inspecting it along the way. For example, you have a network of lymphatic vessels that help reabsorb the fluid at about 600 or 700 lymph nodes, which are basically checkpoints that monitor and cleanse lymph as it filters through. Then there are special lymphoid organs like the spleen, thymus, adenoids, and tonsils, as well as other lymphoid tissues throughout the body. Some of these organs and tissues house special defensive cells of the immune system to fight infection by gobbling up bacteria and other harmful antigens, all of which we'll get a lot more into in upcoming lessons. Others, like the thymus and spleen, provide a nursery for maturing immune cells called lymphocytes. But to understand the special supporting role that your lymphatic system plays in your body, let's start with its origins in the capillary beds of your circulatory system. You'll recall that these beds are where the capillaries carry blood from your arterioles and your arteries before that, and feed blood into your venules and eventually your veins. This is where the transfer of nutrients and waste takes place, as blood pressures force plasma out of the arterial end of the capillaries and into the interstitial fluid between the cells of whatever tissue you happen to be in. And most of that fluid gets drawn right back into the capillaries on the venous end, thanks to osmotic pressure. But some is left behind. Of the 20 liters a day that's forced through the arteriolar end of all the capillaries all over your body, only 17 liters is taken back up by the venous end. Those other 3 liters? That becomes your lymph. It's almost immediately picked up by nearby lymphatic capillaries that wind their way in and among the blood capillaries, and they're really well suited for their job. Lymphatic capillaries are made of loosely overlapping endothelial cells that look kind of like roofing shingles, forming little flap-like valves that only open in one direction. So when the pressure in the interstitial space becomes greater than the pressure inside the lymphatic capillary, the flaps push open and take in fluid to relieve the pressure. Once the fluid is inside a lymphatic capillary, we can officially call it lymph, lymph. Then it flows through successively larger lymphatic vessels to collecting vessels and then the larger trunks, and finally into one of two big ducts that feed back into the lowest pressure area of the circulatory system. The right lymphatic duct drains all the lymph collected from the upper right area of the torso, as well as the right arm and the right sides of the head and thorax, and feeds them all into the internal jugular vein. The larger thoracic duct takes lymph from the rest of the body and dumps it into the subclavian vein. Overall, these vessels work a lot like your veins do. They operate under very low pressure, have a series of valves that prevent backflow, and are helped along a bit by smooth muscle in the vessel walls that keep the fluid moving. Okay, so the lymphatic system takes extra fluid that's squeezed out of the blood capillaries and basically mops it up. That sounds handy, but as a living thing that wants to stay alive, what's in it for you exactly? Well, remember, we're talking about recovering 3 liters of blood fluid per day. That's more than half your total blood volume. If that weren't returned to your circulatory system, you'd be looking at a serious drop in blood pressure and little to no oxygen delivery or waste pickup. Plus, any blockage in the lymph system, like from a tumor that obstructs one of your vessels, can be really dangerous, resulting in edema or swelling that can constrain blood flow and lead to serious complications. And finally, don't forget that your lymph also plays a key role in the function of your immune system. Say you scrape your elbow and some bad stuff, like the Staphylococcus bacteria that's covering your entire body right now, infiltrates some of the loose areolar connective tissue under your skin. Since that tissue is full of interstitial fluid that drains into your lymphatics, which ultimately drain to your heart, you're gonna want to vanquish those bad guys before they have a chance to wreak any havoc. Whatever will you do? Well, this is where your lymph nodes come in. Your body's main lymphoid organs, the lymph nodes, are where your lymph gets close and regular inspection by its resident immune cells, lymphocytes. Depending on what kind of troublemaker they find in the fluid, the lymphocytes might trigger the release of resident macrophages to attack unwanted microorganisms, or they might activate the general immune system outside of the node if they need extra support. The details of how that happens we will get to next time, but for now, just understand that lymphocytes are found in and mature in the loose reticular connective tissue that makes up a large part of the nodes and most of your other lymphoid organs. Now, if a node is overwhelmed by whatever invader it's trying to quell, it may become inflamed. You can actually feel some of your nodes if you poke around the sides of your neck. They feel like little bumps. Little bumps. Yeah, there they are. And noticeably enlarged lymph nodes are often an early diagnostic sign of disease or infection, which is why doctors are always feeling around under your jawline during checkups. But your lymph nodes aren't the system's only checkpoints. You've also got a few special outposts placed at strategic entry points to particularly sensitive tissues, like those in the respiratory and digestive tracts. These are called mucosa-associated lymphoid tissues, or MALTs, because they can be found in mucous membranes around the body outside of the lymphatic vessels. Your tonsils are some of the largest collections of these tissues, which together form a ring around the entrance of the pharynx. There, they can inspect everything you eat and breathe and try to remove any pathogens before they enter the GI tract or lungs. It's a pretty big job, actually, which is why sore throats and swollen tonsils are a common sign of a cold or other infection. Another collection of malts, called Peyer's patches, are in the distal portion of the small intestine, providing another checkpoint along the GI tract. And contrary to popular myth, your appendix is not useless, because it too contains a bunch of lymphoid tissue and is conveniently located where it can destroy any remaining bacteria before it can breach the intestinal wall during absorption. Exactly how your lymph and immune cells detect and destroy the unwanted visitors that might otherwise kill you is what we're going to be talking about for the remainder of this course. But for now, you learned how your unsung lymphatic system supports cardiovascular function by collecting, filtering, and returning interstitial fluid back into the bloodstream via a system of lymphatic vessels. We also talked about the system's major role in fighting off infection and how lymph nodes and other lymphoid organs and MALT areas house antigen-attacking lymphocytes that provide crucial support to the immune system. Thank you to our Headmaster of Learning, Linnea Boyev, and thank you to all of our Patreon patrons whose monthly contributions help make Crash Course possible, not only for themselves, but for everybody everywhere. If you like Crash Course and want to help us keep making videos like this one, you can go to patreon.com/crashcourse. This episode was filmed in the Dr. Cheryl C. Kinney Crash Course studio. It was written by Kathleen Yale. The script was edited by Blake DiPastino, and our consultant is Dr. Brandon Jackson. It was directed by Nicholas Jenkins, edited by Nicole Sweeney. Our sound designer is Michael Aranda, and the graphics team is Thought Cafe.
5.11 The immune system. The immune system is a remarkable defense network that identifies and neutralizes harmful invaders, known as pathogens. When a pathogen enters the body, the immune system assesses whether it poses a threat. If deemed harmful, it activates a response. Antibodies play a key role by binding to specific antigens on the pathogen's surface. This process alerts T killer cells, which then destroy the pathogen. However, some pathogens, such as HIV, evade detection or directly attack the immune system, leaving the body vulnerable. This sophisticated system's primary goal is to protect the body by learning from past infections and responding effectively to new threats. Explanation of immune response. Here's a breakdown of how the immune system fights off pathogens, step by step, using the information provided. 1. The body releases antibodies in response to a detected pathogen. A. Antibody. An antibody is a specialized protein created by the immune system to target specific pathogens. B. Pathogen. A pathogen is a harmful organism, for example bacteria, virus, or fungi, that can cause disease. When the body detects a pathogen, it triggers the immune system to produce antibodies that match the pathogen's unique antigen markers. These antigens are like fingerprints that identify the pathogen. 2. Antibodies bind to the pathogen. The binding process happens in several stages. A. Antibodies use their unique key shape to fit into the pathogen's antigens. This connection is highly specific, like a lock and key, ensuring that the antibody only targets the harmful pathogen. B. More antibodies bind to the pathogens, hindering their ability to cause harm. As antibodies attach, they block the pathogen from invading host cells or spreading in the body. C. Pathogens are bound together, making them less harmful and more obvious to immune cells. This clustering, called agglutination, makes it easier for white blood cells to spot and destroy the pathogens. 3. T killer cell binds to the antibody that has a pathogen bound to its other side. C. White blood cell, killer T cell. This specialized immune cell identifies and eliminates infected or harmful cells. The killer T cell does not directly recognize the pathogen, but uses signals from the antibodies attached to the pathogen. Key receptors involved in this process. D. The antibody receptor on the white blood cell allows the killer T cell to connect to the antibody. E. The receptor on the antibody binds to the pathogen, creating a bridge that ensures the killer T cell targets the correct threat. Summary. Detection. The immune system detects the pathogen and produces specific antibodies. Neutralization. Antibodies bind to the pathogen, rendering it less harmful and marking it for destruction. Destruction. T killer cells recognize the antibody-pathogen complex, bind to it using receptors, and destroy the pathogen. This process highlights the precision of the immune system, which works like a coordinated team to identify, neutralize, and eliminate threats to the body.
You may not know it, but your body is engaged in a never-ending battle. You are literally covered in staph and strep and E. coli and all sorts of dubious characters that are intent on using you and your body's many resources to feed themselves, find shelter, and reproduce as much as they want. And hey, we all gotta make a living, but it is not your job to give these guys a free lunch. So your body has developed a 3-part policy toward these shady customers, and its enforcement is handled by your immune system. The immune system is different from all the other systems we've talked about this year in that it's not a specific tissue, organ, system kind of system. Instead, it involves a whole bunch of different tissue groups, organ systems, and specialized but widely distributed defense cells. Together, this league of extraordinary substances joins forces to perform all of the defense functions your body depends on to keep you alive in an incredibly germy world. And the first line of defense in this never-ending battle, that's your innate or non-specific defense system. Like your average frontline soldier, it's prepared to immediately engage with anyone suspicious, and it mostly includes protective stuff we were born with, like the external barricades of your skin and mucous membranes, and internal defenses like phagocytes, antimicrobial proteins, and other attack cells. But some enemies must be fought with special forces, and here your body can deploy your adaptive or specific defense system, which is more like your SEAL Team 6. It takes more time to call in, but it's specially designed to go after specific targets, and it keeps files on those bad guys so it knows how to handle them next time around. But today we're going to focus on your innate system and look at how it uses an arsenal of physical and chemical barriers, killer cells, and even fever to keep you healthy, proving that sometimes the symptoms we associate with illness are actually the signs that we're healing. Just because something is simple doesn't mean that it can't be elegant. I mean, your body is capable of some incredibly sophisticated things, including defending itself from infection. But occasionally, there's something to be said for brute force. And a lot of your innate immune system's functions aren't exactly subtle. For example, your body's very first line of defense is a simple physical barrier. And it works. Like a wall around a fortress, your skin does a fantastic job of keeping out all manner of malevolent microorganisms. As long as that tough, keratinized epithelial membrane doesn't get torn open or busted up too much, you could probably, make snowballs out of raw sewage and still be alright. Although, no. Your many mucous membranes also provide a handy physical barrier. You'll remember that they align any cavity that opens up into the germy outside world, including the respiratory, digestive, urinary, and reproductive tracts. Not only do your skin and mucosa supply simple physical protection, they also pack some serious chemical weaponry. Eat some questionable leftovers for lunch? Don't worry, your stomach is literally filled with acid, so you probably are covered. Walk face first into your coworker's nasty sneeze cloud? No worries, your nasal passages can whip up a tissue box worth of sticky mucus to help trap viruses before they enter your lungs. You've also got bacteria-fighting enzymes in your saliva and lacrimal eye fluid, and peptides called defensins in your skin and membranes that help keep bacteria and fungi from setting up shop around inflamed or scraped skin. Which, no matter how careful you are, you're gonna get one way or another. Maybe you shave with a dull blade, or you just brush your teeth too hard, and don't get me started about the dangers of bagel cutting. So when you've breached that first simple line of defense, it's time to call on your second line of internal innate defenses. This is where your body starts pulling strategic maneuvers like firing up a fever, releasing chemical signals, causing inflammation, or other defensive tactics that help identify and attack infectious invaders. Some of the first defensive cells on the scene are your phagocytes. Their name literally means to eat, and like Pac-Man, they indiscriminately chase down intruders and gobble them up. And they come in a few different varieties. First, you got neutrophils, which are the most abundant type of your white blood cells. They kind of self-destruct after devouring a pathogen, and in fact, you've probably seen piles of their little dead bodies, because that's what pus is made of. But the bigger, tougher phagocytes are the macrophages. They're derived from monocyte white blood cells that have moved out of the bloodstream to occupy tissues, and some are free types that patrol tissues looking for creepers, while others are fixed, attached to fibers in specific organs, devouring anything suspicious that passes by. So when a macrophage, in say the finger I just cut slicing a bagel, sees a new bacterium coming along, it snares it using cytoplasmic extensions, reels it in, completely engulfs it, and essentially digests it and spits the rest out. And unlike neutrophils, it can do this over and over again, like a boss. But not all your defense cells are phagocytic. You've also got cells with what is by far the awesomest name of any cell in the body, the natural killer cells. You can call them NK cells if you want to, but why would you do that? Anyway, these tiny assassins patrol your blood and lymph looking for abnormal cells, and are unique in that they can kill your own cells if they are infected with viruses or have become cancerous. How can they tell? A normal, healthy human cell contains a special protein on its surface called MHC1, or Major Histocompatibility Complex, but if it's infected, it stops making that protein. And if an NK cell detects a defective cell, it doesn't swallow it whole like a macrophage, it pokes it with an enzyme that triggers apoptosis, or programmed cell death, which is pretty awesome. So those are some ways your innate immune cells handle their enemies, but how do they know where to look in the first place? So let's talk strategery. So say you're in a banana factory, and you slip on a banana peel and you scrape your knees. Your outer fortress has been breached and the pathogens are just flooding in like orcs through Helm's Deep. Banana factories are very dirty places. Now your body wants to contain the spread of pathogens, clean up the mess, and get healing as quickly as possible, so it cues up your inflammatory response. This is basically an internal fire alarm, only it uses chemicals instead of sirens to get the message across, and instead of smoke and fire, you sense redness, swelling, heat, and pain. For example, in the event of injury, specialized mast cells in your connective tissue send out histamine molecules. And histamine is great at calling in the cavalry. For one thing, it causes vasodilation, which creates redness and heat at the site of the injury. Now, those things might freak you out a little, but they're actually signs of healing. The increased temperature, for example, ratchets up the cell's metabolic rate so they can repair themselves faster. Meanwhile, histamines and other inflammatory chemicals also increase the permeability of blood vessels, causing nearby capillaries to release protein-rich fluids. This causes swelling, which again is actually a good thing because that leaked protein helps clot blood and form scabs, while the lymphatic system sucks up and filters that extra fluid, cleaning it up before putting it back into your bloodstream. And of course, like chum to sharks, an inflamed knee is also going to attract a bunch of local phagocytes, which find it easier to escape your now leaky capillaries, and lymphocytes that are also flowing freely, helping to destroy pathogens while also cleaning up dead cell wreckage. And don't forget, during all of this, the neutrophils have been doing their best, but they were the first wave to arrive, so by this time they're starting to die in heaps. They're triggered when the injured knee skin cells release chemicals that begin leukocytosis, the release of neutrophils from the bone marrow, where they're made, into the bloodstream. To attract the neutrophils to the damaged area, inflamed endothelial cells in the capillaries send out chemicals that act like homing devices. And when the neutrophils arrive, they cling to the capillary walls near the injury, flatten themselves out, and squeeze through the vessel walls to get to work. Your big monocytes eventually roll up to the battle and transform into hungry macrophages, replacing the first line of now dead neutrophils and basically just eating up any lingering enemies and then cleaning up the carnage. Now, all this works pretty well in most circumstances, but you may have noticed with a more major injury or an especially nasty virus or infection, sometimes your local troops get overrun. When white blood cells and macrophages run into more foreign invaders than they can handle, they let loose pyrogen chemicals that tap the hypothalamus and raise your body's thermostat, calling in a systemic fever to burn everything. The resulting temperature rise increases the metabolism of your cells so they can heal faster, and it also tells the liver and spleen to hold on to all of their iron and zinc so those things can't contribute to bacterial growth. But even then, sometimes you find yourself facing a more formidable foe. That's when you call in the specialists, your adaptive immune defenses. And to learn exactly how they save the day, you have to watch next time. But for now, you learn that your immune system's responses begin with physical barriers like skin and mucous membranes, and when they're not enough, there are your phagocytes, the neutrophils and macrophages. You also learned about natural killer cells and the inflammatory response, and watched as all of these elements saved the day when you slipped on a banana peel. Thank you to our headmaster of learning, Lenaya Boyev, and thank you to all of our Patreon patrons whose monthly contributions make Crash Course possible, not only for themselves, but for everybody. If you like Crash Course and you want to help us keep making videos like this, you can go to patreon.com/crashcourse. This episode was filmed in the Dr. Cheryl C. Kinney Crash Course studio. It was written by Kathleen Yale. The script was edited by Blake DiPestino, and our consultant is Dr. Brandon Jackson. It was directed by Nicholas Jenkins, edited by Nicole Sweeney. Our sound designer is Michael Aranda, and the graphics team is Thought Cafe.
Five point 1.2 The respiratory system. The respiratory system is the body's gateway for oxygen intake and carbon dioxide removal. Air enters through the nose, which filters particles and adjusts temperature. The trachea then channels the air to the lungs, supported by rings that prevent collapse during inhalation. In the lungs, air travels to tiny structures called alveoli. These are the sites of gas exchange, where oxygen enters the bloodstream and carbon dioxide is expelled. This intricate process connects the respiratory and cardiovascular systems, ensuring every cell in the body receives the oxygen it needs, while removing waste gases efficiently. How this diagram relates to the components of the respiratory system. This diagram divides the respiratory system into two key parts: the upper respiratory tract and the lower respiratory tract, each playing crucial roles. Upper respiratory tract. The sinuses help humidify and filter the air we breathe, making it suitable for the lungs. The throat, pharynx, acts as a passageway for both air and food, guiding air towards the respiratory system. The larynx, or voice box, not only produces sound but also protects the trachea by preventing food from entering the airway. Lower respiratory tract. The trachea serves as a sturdy conduit for air, reinforced by rings to prevent collapse. The bronchi split the air into two parts, one for each lung, ensuring even distribution. The bronchioles, smaller airways within the lungs, lead to the alveoli, where gas exchange occurs to supply oxygen and remove carbon dioxide. Together, these structures work in harmony to ensure oxygen reaches our bloodstream while carbon dioxide is expelled, sustaining life and energy. Introduction to the respiratory system. The respiratory system is one of the body's most critical networks. It brings oxygen into the body and removes carbon dioxide through a series of interconnected components. Let's look at these key parts in detail. Components. First, we have the nose, our primary air intake, designed to filter, humidify, and control the temperature of the air we breathe. Next is the mouth, which serves as a secondary pathway for breathing and plays a dual role in the respiratory and digestive systems. The trachea, or windpipe, then directs the air downwards. Its rigid rings keep it open, ensuring no collapse during inhalation. From the trachea, the air divides into the bronchi, two main branches that lead to the lungs. Once inside the lungs, air is distributed into smaller airways called bronchioles. At the end of these airways are the alveoli, tiny sacs where gas exchange occurs. This is the critical junction between the respiratory and cardiovascular systems, allowing oxygen to enter the bloodstream and carbon dioxide to be expelled. First aid for the respiratory system. In emergency situations where breathing stops, we use CPR with rescue breaths. Chest compressions mimic the heart's pumping, while rescue breaths replenish oxygen. The diaphragm, a muscle beneath the lungs, is vital for effective breathing. Chest compressions alone are insufficient for proper oxygenation, so rescue breaths are added to ensure the patient's survival. This coordinated action restores the function of both the heart and lungs. Conclusion. The respiratory system is a sophisticated yet delicate structure, and understanding its function is essential for both healthcare professionals and responders providing life-saving first aid.
Let me introduce you to one of the bravest pioneers in the history of life on planet Earth. An organism that blazed the trail for every single vertebrate that lives on land today and many that don't. It's one of your most important ancestors. Meat? Well, it doesn't have a name. And we don't exactly know what it looked like either. But we do know that about 380 million years ago, this fishy-looking thing with big fleshy fins achieved one of the animal kingdom's greatest milestones: breathing air. Sounds simple enough, but believe me, it wasn't. Because for billions of years before this fishy ancestor came around, basically all of life evolved in water. From the very beginning, the earliest, simplest forms of life, like bacteria, extracted oxygen they needed right from the water through their membranes. And they did it through simple diffusion, when a material automatically flows from where it is concentrated to where it is less concentrated, so it balances out. Diffusion works really well, and it requires zero effort, but it wasn't going to cut it in the big leagues. Anything larger than a small worm is simply too big and needs too much oxygen for diffusion to work. So in order to get bigger, early life forms needed a circulatory system that could move bulk amounts of oxygen around faster inside their bodies, and a respiratory system to bring more oxygen in contact with their wet membranes. So their respiratory surfaces moved from their outer surfaces to the insides of their bodies. First there were gills, but gills of course still only work inside of water. And a little more than 380 million years ago, this was starting to lose some of its charm. Earth was getting warmer, the seas were getting shallower, and much of the planet's surface water had lower concentrations of oxygen than it used to. Finally, a humble little lobe-finned fish got fed up, swam up to the water's surface, and started breathing air. It could do this because it had evolved a fancy new interface to move gases between the air and its cell membranes. I'm talking about lungs. Wet lungs. With an efficient new way to take in nearly limitless amounts of oxygen from air, animals were eventually able to get bigger and more diverse over the ages, and now all of us lung-having vertebrates share that common ancestor. For lots of animals, including humans, those lungs come with a bunch of other equipment like protective ribs, a stiff trachea, and in mammals, a strong diaphragm. And together, they form your respiratory system, which happens to be best friends and business partners with your circulatory system. It's only by working together and using both the bulk flow and simple diffusion of oxygen that they can make possible the process of cellular respiration. In other words, life itself. So a lot of improvements have been made to it over the eons, but the respiratory system that you are using right now is your inheritance from that ancient, ambitious fish, leader of one of the most important anatomical revolutions of the past 500 million years. Pretend for a minute that you can't breathe. Like, you just don't have lungs anymore. You are some bizarre evolutionary oddity, a huge human-shaped organism that doesn't have a respiratory system. Instead, you get all of your oxygen the way that your oldest, smallest evolutionary ancestors did, by simple diffusion, or at least you try to get all your oxygen that way. How would it work? Well, poorly. And that's partly because one of the keys to efficient diffusion of any material is distance. If you want a molecule to diffuse across a space quickly, you want it to be as close to its destination as possible, with the fewest obstacles in the way. But for a single molecule of oxygen to diffuse from the air through, say, your scalp and then go to a neuron deep inside your brain, it would have to move through your skin and then your skull and then your connective tissue and all sorts of things. It would eventually get there, like maybe a month later, but at that point the cell that needed the oxygen in the first place would have, suffocated to death. Basically, obtaining oxygen through diffusion alone is like wanting to go to a party at your friend's place across town and then walking 20 miles to get there. You could do it, but it would take forever, and by the time you arrived, you'd be all haggard and the party would be over. So diffusion alone isn't enough to get the job done. We do use it, but only when a whole bunch of the materials we need are right up against the tissues that can absorb them. So you know what else we need? Bulk flow. Bulk flow is like public transportation. It moves large numbers of molecules quickly. Rather than walk the whole way across town, you can hop on a bus with a bunch of other people and get there in 20 minutes. Every time you take a deep breath, you bring in about 100 quintillion oxygen molecules into your lungs all at once. They're on a bulk flow bus ride. And once those oxygen molecules filter down into the cells in your lungs, they're suddenly very close to the blood they're trying to reach. All they have to do is diffuse across 4 layers of cell membranes to get from the lung cell into the blood. It's like hopping off the bus and then walking a half a block to your friend's apartment. That's why your respiratory system is the way it is. It's set up to take full advantage of both bulk flow and simple diffusion. The bulk flow part of things is handled by some of your system's biggest and most obvious moving parts, starting with your lungs, which basically operate like a pump or a bellows. They don't have any contractible muscle tissue because they need to be able to expand, so they require outside help in order to move. Enter the diaphragm, a big, thin set of muscles that separates your thorax from your abdomen. When your lungs empty, your diaphragm relaxes and looks kind of like an arc pushing up to squish your lungs. You also have the weight of your rib cage pushing on your lungs from the top and sides, and together these forces decrease the volume of your lungs. When you breathe in, your diaphragm contracts, pulling itself flat, and your external intercostal muscles between your ribs contract. They lift the ribs up and out, causing the chest cavity to expand. This makes the pressure inside your lungs lower than the air outside your body, and since fluids like gases move from areas of high pressure to low pressure, the lungs fill up with outside air. Then the diaphragm relaxes again, and the weight of the ribs settles in, and the pressure inside the lungs becomes higher than the outside air, and the air rushes out. And that, my friends, is breathing 101. Now, your respiratory system contains a lot of parts besides your lungs, some prominently displayed on your face, others hidden deep within your chest, and functionally all of these organs fall into one of 2 physiological zones. The upper parts that funnel the air in make up what's known as the conducting zone, and it starts with this thing. Your nose is supported by bone and cartilage and the bristly hairs and mucus inside it that help filter out dust and other particles. But it, along with your sinuses, performs another important function. It warms and moistens incoming air so it doesn't dry out those sensitive lung cells that must remain wet. Remember, moisture is key. We evolved from organisms that lived in water, so just like with our aquatic bacterial ancestors, we need water for oxygen to dissolve into before it can diffuse across the phospholipid bilayer membrane of our cells. Now, if you've ever choked on a poorly timed sip of water, you've noticed that you breathe through the same tube that you also move foods and liquids through. This is yet another leftover from those first fish lungs, which evolved as a branch off the esophagus. Looking back, it was not ideal, but we are stuck with it. So the stuff that you swallow soon encounters the epiglottis, a little trapdoor of tissue which covers the larynx and directs bites of sandwich and sips of cola towards your esophagus and keeps them out of your lungs. And you'll notice that the esophagus, which heads to your stomach, is nice and flexible, while your trachea, or windpipe, is rigid and has prominent rings. That's because your trachea is basically built like a vacuum vacuum hose. Since the lungs create negative pressure with every breath, the trachea needs those rings to keep it open. If it were soft and floppy, it would collapse every time the pressure dropped and you wouldn't be able to breathe. From there, the trachea splits in two, forming the right and left main bronchi. You can imagine these inner lung parts as sort of an upside-down tree. Now we are in the lung tissue and have entered what we call the respiratory zone. This is where the actual gas exchange occurs, and everything you find here has a form to suit that function. So the smaller branches of the upside-down tree are bronchioles, which taper down into progressively narrower tubes until they empty into the alveolar ducts and then dead end into tiny alveolar sacs, where the bulk of the gas exchange finally occurs. Because that's where each sac contains a cluster of alveoli, these tiny cavities lined with super thin wet membranes made of simple squamous epithelium tissue. It's here that oxygen molecules dissolve in the wet mucus, diffuse across the epithelial cells, and then cross the single layer of endothelial cells lining the capillaries to enter the bloodstream. And of course, it's also where carbon dioxide diffuses out of the blood and then follows the same route back up to the nose and mouth where it's exhaled. So it's your alveoli where diffusion meets bulk flow, because while you're picking up oxygen and dispensing with CO2 one molecule at a time, you're doing it in enormous quantities at any given second. Both of your lungs contain about 700 million alveoli, which together provide an amazing 75 square meters of moist membrane surface area. So the principles that make respiration possible are relatively simple: diffusion and bulk flow. And so are the mechanisms in your body that use them. It just took us about 400 million years to figure out how to make it all work. But today you learned how it does work, including the mechanics of both simple diffusion and bulk flow, and the physiology of breathing, and the anatomy of the conducting zone and the respiratory zone of your respiratory system. Thank you to all of our Patreon patrons who help make Crash Course possible for themselves and for everyone in the world for free with their monthly contributions. If you like Crash Course and you want to help us keep making videos like this one, you can go to patreon.com/crashcourse. This episode was filmed in the Dr. Cheryl C. Kinney Crash Course studio. It was written by Kathleen Yale. The script was edited by Blake DiPestino, and our consultant is Dr. Brandon Jackson. It was directed and edited by Nicholas Jenkins. The script supervisor was Nicole Sweeney. Our sound designer is Michael Randa, and the graphics team is Thought Cafe.
The respiratory system and first aid. In emergency situations where a patient is not breathing on their own, providing CPR with rescue breathing becomes critical. Let's break this down and understand its importance and process in detail. Imagine a scenario where someone collapses due to cardiac arrest. Their heart has stopped pumping effectively, and as a result, blood is no longer circulating oxygen to the brain and vital organs. The respiratory system has also shut down, and without immediate intervention, their life is at risk. This is where CPR, cardiopulmonary resuscitation, steps in. It combines chest compressions and rescue breathing to keep the body functioning until professional help arrives. The chest compressions serve two purposes. They mimic the action of the heart pumping blood around the body. They create a small amount of airflow in and out of the lungs, though this is not sufficient on its own. That's why rescue breathing is so vital. By giving breaths into the patient's mouth, you actively ventilate their lungs, ensuring oxygen reaches the alveoli, the tiny air sacs where gas exchange happens. Without rescue breathing, oxygen levels in the bloodstream would drop rapidly, causing organ damage or death. Consider the role of the diaphragm, a large muscle below the lungs that helps with breathing. In a healthy person, the diaphragm contracts and relaxes with each breath, pulling air in and pushing carbon dioxide out. However, in an unresponsive patient, the diaphragm is inactive, and the lungs need external assistance to perform this function. For example, imagine a drowning victim pulled from the water. They may have water obstructing their airway, preventing normal breathing. By clearing the airway and providing rescue breaths, you are not only helping oxygenate their blood, but also clearing carbon dioxide, which could otherwise poison the body. Another scenario could involve a person who suffered a severe asthma attack, rendering their respiratory system too weak to function. Rescue breaths can temporarily take over this role until medical professionals arrive with equipment like ventilators or oxygen masks. In summary, chest compressions and rescue breathing together simulate the dual functions of the heart and lungs. By ensuring oxygen delivery and circulation, you're buying time for the patient, a crucial window that could mean the difference between life and death. Choking and aspiration, understanding the threat and management. The respiratory and digestive systems share a critical junction where air and food pass through the throat. This dual-purpose pathway, though efficient, carries the inherent risk of choking and aspiration. Here's an in-depth explanation. What happens during choking and aspiration? Normal function of the epiglottis. The epiglottis is a flap-like structure at the entrance of the airway. It plays a crucial role in preventing choking by closing off the airway when we swallow food or liquid, directing it into the esophagus. After swallowing, the epiglottis reopens to allow air to flow freely into the trachea. Choking. Choking occurs when the epiglottis fails to block the airway properly, or when a foreign object enters the trachea instead of the esophagus. This obstruction can block airflow, causing the person to cough, struggle for air, or become unconscious if untreated. Aspiration. Aspiration happens when foreign materials, for example, food, water, vomit, accidentally enter the airway or lungs. Unlike choking, aspiration may not always cause immediate symptoms, but can lead to complications like pneumonia. Triggers of choking and aspiration. Food lodged in the airway due to improper chewing or talking while eating. Liquids entering the trachea during drinking. Blockage caused by blood, mucus, or vomit during an illness or injury. Tongue obstruction in unconscious individuals. Throat spasms triggered by water or other irritants. Scenarios. Choking on food. Imagine a person eating a steak who starts to talk and laugh mid-bite. A piece of meat lodges in their throat, blocking the airway. Response: encourage them to cough forcefully. If unsuccessful, administer the Heimlich maneuver, abdominal thrusts, to dislodge the food. Aspiration of vomit. A semi-conscious patient lying on their back vomits, and some of the vomit enters their airway. Response: quickly turn the patient onto their side to clear the airway. Perform suction if trained and seek immediate medical attention. Asthma or anaphylaxis. A patient having an asthma attack experiences airway obstruction due to mucus buildup. In anaphylaxis, the airway swells due to an allergic reaction. Response: administer prescribed medication, for example, an asthma inhaler or epinephrine for anaphylaxis, and call for emergency assistance. Water aspiration during swimming. A swimmer accidentally inhales water, triggering a throat spasm. Their airway remains closed even after the water is gone. Response: ensure the swimmer is brought to a safe position. Administer rescue breaths if breathing has stopped, and seek medical help. Management and first aid for choking for a conscious patient. Encourage coughing. This is the body's natural reflex to clear the airway. Perform the Heimlich maneuver, stand behind the patient, place your hands above their navel and give upward thrusts. For an unconscious patient, lay the patient on their back and open the airway by tilting the head and lifting the chin. Perform chest compressions and attempt to clear the obstruction using a finger sweep, only if you see the object. For infants, administer back blows, position the infant face down on your forearm and deliver 5 gentle yet firm blows between the shoulder blades. Alternate with chest thrusts, turn the infant face up and give 5 compressions with 2 fingers. Prevention eating habits. Chew food thoroughly and avoid talking or laughing while eating. Cut food into small, manageable pieces, especially for children or elderly individuals. Supervision. Monitor children and ensure they do not put small objects or hard-to-swallow food in their mouths. Positioning. Ensure that patients who are at risk of vomiting or choking are placed in a recovery position, on their side. Managing underlying conditions. Patients with asthma or allergies should have their prescribed medication readily available. Conclusion. Choking and aspiration are preventable and manageable if addressed promptly and with the right techniques. Understanding the role of the epiglottis and how these scenarios occur helps us respond effectively. Whether it's dislodging food with abdominal thrusts or managing an asthma attack with medication, timely intervention can save lives. The gastrointestinal system is a vital component of the human body, responsible for processing the food we consume and transforming it into essential nutrients. This system is divided into two main parts. The term gastro refers to the stomach, which initiates the digestive process, while intestinal pertains to the intestines, which complete the task by absorbing nutrients and expelling waste. The process of digestion begins when food enters the stomach. Here, it is crushed into smaller pieces and mixed with digestive chemicals, such as stomach acids. This mixture is then passed to the intestines, where the nutrients are absorbed into the bloodstream to nourish the body. Whatever remains, essentially waste, is eventually expelled. The primary function of the system is to ensure that our bodies receive the nutrients necessary for energy, growth, and repair. However, the gastrointestinal system is not without risks. It can be adversely affected by injuries, infections, or poisoning, which can impair its ability to function. For example, food poisoning, caused by bacteria in contaminated food, can lead to dehydration and other serious complications if not treated promptly. Understanding how the system works and recognizing potential risks is not just fascinating but also crucial for maintaining good health and responding effectively in first aid scenarios. The diagram before you illustrates the key components of the gastrointestinal system, which is responsible for digestion and nutrient absorption. Let's explore each part and its specific function. 1. Salivary glands. Digestion begins in the mouth, where the salivary glands secrete saliva. This fluid contains enzymes like amylase that start breaking down carbohydrates into simpler sugars. Saliva also moistens food, making it easier to chew and swallow. 2. Esophagus. The esophagus is a muscular tube that transports food from the mouth to the stomach. Through a series of rhythmic contractions known as peristalsis, the esophagus ensures food moves efficiently down into the stomach for further digestion. 3. Stomach. The stomach plays a critical role in breaking down food. It secretes strong acids and digestive enzymes, which help in the breakdown of proteins. The churning action of the stomach also mechanically processes food, turning it into a semi-liquid mixture called chyme. 4. Liver. The liver is a vital organ that processes nutrients absorbed from the digestive system. It produces bile, which helps break down fats into smaller molecules for easier absorption in the intestines. Additionally, the liver detoxifies harmful substances and stores essential vitamins and minerals. 5. Gallbladder. The gallbladder works as a storage reservoir for bile produced by the liver. When fatty foods are consumed, the gallbladder releases bile into the small intestine to aid in the digestion and absorption of fats. 6. Pancreas. The pancreas is an essential organ for digestion and blood sugar regulation. It produces enzymes that break down carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. It also secretes insulin and glucagon to regulate blood glucose levels. 7. Small intestine. The small intestine is where most nutrient absorption occurs. It consists of 3 sections, the duodenum, jejunum, and ileum. Enzymes and bile combine here to complete the digestion process, allowing nutrients to pass into the bloodstream. 8. Large intestine. The large intestine absorbs water and electrolytes from the remaining indigestible food matter. It compacts the waste into solid form, preparing it for elimination. 9. Rectum. The rectum is the final section of the gastrointestinal system. It stores solid waste, or feces, until it is expelled from the body during a bowel movement. The urinary or renal system is an essential part of the human body, responsible for filtering waste, maintaining fluid balance, and regulating various critical processes. Let's break down its key components. Kidneys. The kidneys are two bean-shaped organs that filter blood to remove toxic waste and excess substances. They play a crucial role in regulating electrolyte balance and produce important hormones, such as erythropoietin, which aids in red blood cell production, and renin, which regulates blood pressure. Ureters. From each kidney, a tube called a ureter transports urine to the bladder. These tubes rely on rhythmic contractions, known as peristalsis, to move the urine efficiently. Bladder. The bladder is a muscular, hollow organ that temporarily stores urine. It has a capacity of 400 to 600 milliliters. Nerves embedded in the bladder wall send signals to the brain when it is full, allowing the body to initiate urination. Urethra. The urethra is the final passageway for urine to exit the body. In males, it also serves as a conduit for semen during ejaculation. Blood vessels. The renal arteries deliver oxygen-rich blood to the kidneys for filtration. After filtering, the renal veins return clean blood to the heart, ensuring circulation of purified blood throughout the body. Abnormalities. It's important to monitor the health of the renal system. Symptoms such as loss of bladder control or the presence of blood in urine may indicate underlying medical problems. These issues could be related to the renal system itself or other conditions requiring medical attention. In a first aid context, recognizing these symptoms can lead to timely interventions, such as rehydration, monitoring for infection, or seeking advanced medical care to protect kidney function. The diagram in front of us illustrates the urinary system, also known as the renal system, which is responsible for maintaining the body's fluid balance, removing waste products, and regulating vital functions like blood pressure and red blood cell production. Let's explore each part in detail. 1. Kidneys, right and left. The kidneys are two bean-shaped organs located on either side of the spine. Their primary function is to filter blood, removing toxins and excess substances. They regulate electrolytes, such as sodium and potassium, and control blood pressure through the secretion of hormones like renin. The kidneys also produce erythropoietin, which stimulates red blood cell production. 2. Aorta and inferior vena cava. The aorta, the largest artery in the body, delivers oxygen-rich blood to the kidneys through the renal arteries. After filtration, the cleaned blood returns to the heart via the inferior vena cava through the renal veins, ensuring the circulation of purified blood. 3. Ureters. The ureters are narrow, muscular tubes that transport urine from each kidney to the bladder. This process is facilitated by peristalsis, a series of wave-like muscle contractions that prevent backflow and ensure the efficient movement of urine. 4. Bladder. The bladder is a hollow, elastic organ that stores urine until it is expelled from the body. It can hold approximately 400 to 600 milliliters of urine. The bladder has stretch receptors that send signals to the brain when it becomes full, prompting the urge to urinate. 5. Urethra. The urethra is the final part of the urinary system, functioning as the passageway for urine to exit the body. In males, the urethra also serves as a conduit for semen during ejaculation, making it part of both the urinary and reproductive systems. Key functions. The urinary system is integral to maintaining homeostasis by filtering and excreting waste products through urine, regulating water levels, electrolytes, and acid-base balance, supporting overall circulation through hormone production. Relevance to first aid. Understanding the urinary system's structure is crucial for identifying and managing medical conditions. Symptoms like back pain, blood in the urine, or difficulty urinating could indicate kidney stones, infections, or other issues. Timely intervention, such as rehydration or seeking medical assistance, can prevent complications and preserve renal health. The reproductive system is a vital network of organs designed specifically for the purpose of sexual reproduction. While many organs in the human body are shared by both sexes, the reproductive system is fundamentally different in its structure, function, and the hormones it produces in males and females. 1. Purpose and structure. The reproductive system includes specialized organs that enable the process of reproduction. In males, the testes produce sperm and testosterone, while in females, the ovaries produce eggs and hormones like estrogen and progesterone. These systems are highly specialized to support fertilization, pregnancy, and childbirth. 2. Genetic basis of reproduction. The genetic code embedded in DNA determines biological sex. Females typically have 2 X chromosomes, 20, while males have 1 X and 1 Y chromosome, XY. This genetic distinction is present in every cell of the body and lays the foundation for reproductive functions. 3. Fertilization. Reproduction begins at the moment of fertilization, when a sperm cell from the male fuses with an egg cell from the female. This creates a zygote, a single cell with a unique DNA code, combining genetic material from both parents. This zygote represents the beginning of a new human life, which will continue to develop and grow within the mother's body. 4. Pregnancy and development. During pregnancy, the zygote develops into a fetus, completely dependent on the mother's body for nourishment, oxygen, and protection. This development occurs over approximately 9 months, culminating in childbirth. 5. Labor and childbirth. Labor involves rhythmic contractions of the uterus, which increase in intensity over time. The cervix dilates to allow the baby to pass through the birth canal. This process, though natural, can be physically demanding and, in some cases, medically complex. 6. Risks and complications. Complications during pregnancy and childbirth can pose risks to both the mother and the child. These may include miscarriage, preterm labor, or difficult deliveries that require specialized medical intervention. Recognizing signs of distress, such as prolonged labor or severe bleeding, is crucial in first aid scenarios to ensure timely medical care. Relevance to first aid. First responders must be aware of the complexities of the reproductive system and its functions. In emergencies, providing support during complications, such as labor distress, recognizing symptoms of miscarriage, or addressing post-birth bleeding can save lives. Male reproductive organs. Penis delivers semen during intercourse and serves as the exit for urine. Testis produces sperm and testosterone, the primary male hormone. Scrotum protects the testes and regulates their temperature to support sperm production. Vas deferens transports sperm from the testes to the prostate gland. Prostate gland produces fluid that nourishes and protects sperm, aids in semen ejaculation. Seminal vesicle produces a sugar-rich fluid that provides energy for sperm. Urethra conducts urine and semen out of the body, serving dual roles in the male system. Female reproductive organs. Ovary produces eggs, oocytes, for fertilization and secretes female hormones, estrogen and progesterone. Fallopian tube transports eggs from the ovary to the uterus. Fertilization typically occurs here. Uterus houses and nurtures the developing fetus during pregnancy, contracts during childbirth. Cervix acts as the gateway between the uterus and vagina, allowing the passage of menstrual flow, sperm, and childbirth. Vagina receives the penis during intercourse, provides an outlet for menstrual flow, and serves as the birth canal during delivery. The female reproductive system is specialized for producing eggs, supporting fertilization, and nurturing the development of a fetus. Ovaries. Located on either side of the uterus, the ovaries produce eggs, or oocytes, which are released during ovulation. They also secrete hormones such as estrogen and progesterone, which regulate the menstrual cycle and support pregnancy. Fallopian tubes. These tubes transport the egg from the ovary to the uterus. If sperm fertilizes the egg, this process typically occurs in the fallopian tube. If not, the egg continues its journey and is shed during menstruation. Uterus. The uterus is a muscular organ that accommodates a developing fetus during pregnancy. It plays a critical role in childbirth, as its walls contract to push the baby through the birth canal. Vagina and vulva. The vagina is a muscular canal that serves multiple functions. It receives the penis during intercourse, acts as the birth canal during childbirth, and provides an outlet for menstrual flow. The opening of the vagina is referred to as the vulva. Urethra. The urethra in females is separate from the reproductive system, running above the vagina to expel urine from the bladder. The male reproductive system. The male reproductive system is designed for the production, storage, and delivery of sperm, as well as the production of hormones like testosterone. Testes and scrotum. The testes produce sperm and testosterone. Sperm production requires a cooler temperature than the body's normal 37 degrees Celsius, which is why the testes are housed in the scrotum, a structure that regulates temperature. Vas deferens. This duct transports sperm from the testes to the prostate gland, where it mixes with fluids to form semen. Prostate gland. The prostate gland produces a fluid that nourishes and protects sperm. During ejaculation, its muscles contract to propel semen through the urethra. Penis and urethra. The penis delivers semen into the female reproductive system during intercourse. It also contains the urethra, which serves as a passage for both urine and semen. During sexual arousal, the vascular spaces in the penis fill with blood, resulting in an erection. Integration and function. Together, these systems are essential for the process of reproduction. The female system provides the egg and environment for fertilization, while the male system delivers sperm to fertilize the egg. After fertilization, the zygote implants in the uterus, where it develops into a fetus. Implications for first aid. Understanding these systems is critical in first aid situations, such as recognizing complications during pregnancy, childbirth, or reproductive organ injuries. For example, vaginal bleeding during pregnancy may indicate a miscarriage and requires urgent medical attention. Testicular injuries in males or significant pain may signal torsion, which is a medical emergency. This knowledge aids in providing timely and appropriate care. Before we move on to the next section, we'd like to remind you that the following questionnaires are an essential part of your learning journey. As part of the blended learning program, you'll need to complete these questions in your notebook. This activity is designed to deepen your understanding of the material covered so far and ensure that you can apply these critical first aid concepts in real-life situations. Take your time to work through each question thoughtfully. Use examples from your manual and your own knowledge to support your answers. Remember, this exercise isn't just about answering the questions, it's about reinforcing what you've learned and preparing yourself to act confidently in emergency situations. If you're unsure about any of the answers, refer back to your notes or the manual for guidance. Additionally, keep track of your questions or areas where you feel uncertain, so you can address these during the interactive or instructor-led sessions. Once you've completed the questions, make sure to review your answers and identify key areas for improvement. This step is vital for your growth and development as a competent first aider. Let's get started. Grab your notebook and begin tackling the questions. Remember, this is your opportunity to strengthen your understanding and build your skills. Good luck! Answers and explanations. 5.8 The endocrine system. True. The endocrine system releases hormones directly into the bloodstream to regulate various functions like growth and metabolism. False. The pancreas produces insulin, not adrenaline. Adrenaline is produced by the adrenal glands. True. Hormones play a crucial role in regulating essential body processes, including reproduction, sleep, and energy levels. 5.9 The cardiovascular system. True. Arteries carry oxygen-rich blood away from the heart, while veins carry deoxygenated blood back to the heart. True. The heart pumps 4 to 5 liters of blood per minute to circulate oxygen and nutrients effectively in a resting adult. True. Capillaries allow the exchange of oxygen, carbon dioxide, and nutrients between blood and tissues due to their thin walls. 5.10 The lymphatic system. True. The lymphatic system helps maintain fluid balance by collecting excess tissue fluid and returning it to the bloodstream. True. Lymph nodes filter lymph, trapping pathogens and producing white blood cells to combat infections. False. The lymphatic system plays a key role in immune responses by identifying and fighting infections. 5.11 The immune system. True. Antibodies bind to pathogens to neutralize or mark them for destruction by immune cells. True. T killer cells bind to pathogens tagged by antibodies and destroy them by engulfing or breaking them down. False. The immune system fights bacterial, viral, and fungal infections, as well as other harmful agents. 5.12 The respiratory system. True. The trachea's cartilage rings prevent it from collapsing during inhalation, ensuring air can flow into the lungs. False. Gas exchange happens in the alveoli, not the bronchioles. The alveoli are specialized for this process. True. Rescue breaths during CPR provide oxygen to the patient's lungs while chest compressions mimic heart function. 5.13 The gastrointestinal system. True. The gastrointestinal system consists of the stomach and intestines, which process food and absorb nutrients. False. Food poisoning directly affects the gastrointestinal system, causing symptoms like diarrhea and vomiting. True. Nutrients are absorbed in the intestines after digestion, nourishing the body. 5.14 The renal system. True. The kidneys filter toxins and waste from the blood, producing urine that is stored in the bladder. False. Blood in urine is abnormal and may indicate an infection or other medical condition requiring attention. False. The ureters transport urine from the kidneys to the bladder, not the other way around. 5.15 The reproductive system. Female reproductive system. 22. True. The ovaries produce eggs and hormones like estrogen, which regulate reproduction and menstruation. 23. True. During childbirth, the uterus contracts to push the baby through the birth canal. 24. True. The vagina is involved in sexual intercourse and serves as a pathway for menstruation and childbirth. Male reproductive system. 25. True. The testes produce sperm and testosterone, which are vital for male reproductive function. 26. False. Sperm production requires a temperature slightly below 37 degrees Celsius, which is why the testes are in the scrotum. 27. True. The prostate gland secretes fluid that helps transport and nourish sperm during ejaculation.